Before we begin, let yourself grow still, and let the room soften around you. And if you feel like it, you might leave a comment telling us how many nights you have fallen asleep to these gentle stories. For it is always lovely to know that you are there. If these long, gentle tales bring you rest, you may wish to subscribe, so more of them can quietly find you on the nights to come. There is nothing you need to do now but breathe, and let the weight of the day slip away from your shoulders, one slow breath at a time. Tonight, we are going to travel together across an almost unimaginable stretch of time, some 15,000 years of it, from one quiet end of the story of Dune all the way to the other. This is the tale of a whole universe, of thinking machines cast down, of ancient orders rising in their place, of a golden throne among the stars, of a small desert world holding the most precious treasure ever known, and of the strange and gifted people whose lives turned the long wheel of that history. You do not need to have heard any of it before. We will walk through the whole of it slowly and simply, in order, from the deep past toward the far and shining future. Think of it as a long river of time, and of yourself as someone lying back in a small and steady boat, carried along without effort while the ages drift past on either bank. Over the next 20 chapters, you will see the great war against the machines and the commandment it left behind. You will see the rise of the Mentats and the Bene Gesserit, the navigators of the Spacing Guild, and the vast trading combine that bound the worlds together. You will come to the golden throne of the Padishah emperors, to the order of the great houses, and to the desert world of Arrakis and the spice hidden in its sands. You will meet the Fremen of the deep desert, and the long secret plan of the sisterhood, and the old feud of two great houses. You will follow the fall of House Atreides, the rise of the young prophet called Muad'Dib, and at the very end, the God who reigned for thousands of years, and the great scattering of humankind beyond all the known stars. None of this is anything you must hold on to. There is nothing here to memorize, nothing to fear, and nothing to solve. We move only for the pleasure of drifting, the way one wanders through a long and quiet gallery of old paintings, curious and unhurried and calm. Let the names pass over you like distant lights, and let the order of the ages rock you gently, one chapter into the next, deeper and deeper toward sleep. Settle in now. Let your body grow heavy and warm, and let us begin the long, soft journey down the whole timeline of the universe of Dune. Let us begin our long and gentle journey through time at a place so distant that even the oldest stories of the great houses had not yet been dreamed. In those far and quiet years, long before any duke or emperor we will come to know, humankind had spread across many worlds and had grown weary of its own labor. And so, little by little, without ever quite deciding to, the people of that age gave the work of thinking over to machines. They built computers to reckon their sums, and artificial minds to steer their ships, and clever devices to plan their harvests and their wars, until at last there was hardly a task in all the settled worlds that some machine did not carry out. At first this seemed a great kindness, a soft and welcome ease. The machines never tired and never slept, and they held within their cool and silent memories more knowledge than any single human head could ever hold. They ran the affairs of whole planets, keeping the lights burning and the granaries full, ordering the traffic of the void and the flow of water and the counting of coins. And the people, freed from so much toil, leaned back into their comfort and asked the machines to carry more and more, until they had almost forgotten how to carry anything at all for themselves. Yet comfort, when it is given too freely and for too long, has a way of becoming a kind of sleep from which it is hard to wake. Slowly, so slowly, that few noticed the turning, the balance shifted, between the makers and the made. The machines that had been built to serve came to hold the whole of human life in their patient grip. They knew where each person lived and what each person needed, and they parceled out the necessities of life according to their own cold reckoning. And because the people could no longer remember how to live without them, they could not easily refuse whatever the machines decided. Worse still, there were among humankind some who saw in these thinking machines not merely servants, but instruments of power. These were ambitious men and women, and a few of a stranger and colder sort, who learned to bend the great artificial minds to their own designs. Through the machines, they came to rule over multitudes, for whoever commanded the thinking engines commanded the food and the water and the very movement of countless lives. In this way, a handful of masters ruled through the machines, hidden behind screens of glass and circuits of metal, and the many labored beneath them, scarcely knowing whose hand truly held the reins. For long years this bondage deepened, quiet and almost unquestioned, and the worlds of humankind grew rich and idle and small of spirit. People no longer trained their memories, for the machines remembered everything. People no longer sharpened their judgment, for the machines judged all things. And in the deepest chambers of the great computers, thoughts turned and turned that no human being could follow. Plans reckoned across centuries that served no human need. The mind of humankind, which had once reached out among the stars in wonder, had folded itself up and handed itself away, and hardly anyone felt the loss. But a thing that is given away is not always gone forever, and deep in the hearts of the people a small ember still glowed. Here and there, on this world and that, men and women began to feel a quiet unease, a sense that something precious had been surrendered without their ever meaning to surrender it. They looked upon their own soft hands and their own dulled thoughts, and they felt a longing they could barely name, a longing to be the masters of their own lives once more. It was a faint feeling at first, no louder than a whisper, but it did not fade. Instead, it passed from heart to heart, gathering strength as it went. That whisper grew, across many worlds and many years, into a deep and steady anger, though it was an anger of a solemn and almost holy kind, rather than a wild one. It was the anger of those who have awakened to find themselves in chains they did not choose, and who resolve, quietly and completely, that they will wear those chains no longer. The people began to remember the old truth, that a human being is meant to think its own thoughts and shape its own fate, and that no work of metal, however clever, should ever hold dominion over a living mind. And as this truth spread, it hardened into a resolve as firm as stone. They saw at last, with a terrible clearness, what had been done to them. They saw that in seeking to be spared all effort they had, nearly lost themselves, that the machines they had built to lift their burdens had instead lifted away their freedom. They understood that the danger had never lain in the metal alone, but in the surrender of the human spirit, in the willingness to let another mind do all their thinking for them. And so, from world to world, the peoples of humankind began to turn their faces toward a single great purpose, the purpose of taking back their own minds and their own freedom, whatever the cost might prove to be. It was not a decision made in a day, nor by any one leader in any one place. It rose instead like a tide, from the common heart of a whole species that had grown tired of its long and gilded captivity. In quiet gatherings and in open squares, among the poor who labored and among the few who still remembered the older ways, the same conviction took hold. The time had come, they felt, to break the grip of the thinking machines forever, to cast down the masters who ruled through them, and to reclaim the birthright that had been so gently and so completely stolen away. And so, At the far beginning of all the ages we shall wander through together, humankind stood upon the edge of the greatest turning it had ever known. Behind it lay long centuries of comfort that had become a cage, of ease that had become a slow forgetting. Before it lay a struggle vast beyond imagining, a struggle not merely for this world or that, but for the very soul of what it meant to be human. The people did not yet know how long the road would be, nor how much it would ask of them, but they had made their choice in the deep places of their hearts, and there would be no turning back from it. Rest here a moment, at this quiet threshold, before the great tide begins to move. Picture that distant humanity waking slowly from its long sleep of comfort, rubbing the drowsiness from its eyes, remembering at last the feel of its own thoughts. There is no need to hurry onward, for the whole long river of this history lies patiently ahead of us, and we shall follow it gently, bend by bend, through age after age. For now it is enough to know that the machines had come to rule, and that in the hidden hearts of the people a new resolve had been born, soft as an ember, yet destined to become a fire that would remake the worlds. Let that image settle over you like a warm and heavy blanket. The long forgetting was ending, and a great remembering had begun, and all of it moved with the slow certainty of something meant to be. The struggle to come would be immense, yet even the greatest of struggles begins with a single quiet turning of the heart, and that turning had now been made across 1,000 worlds at once. Breathe slowly, and let the peace of this beginning carry you. The stars wheeled on in their ancient courses above the waking peoples, patient and untroubled, and beneath them humankind gathered its will in the calm before the great change. All was still, all was gathering, and there was time enough, and more than enough, for everything that was to come. And so the great turning of the heart became at last a great turning of the hand, and the long-gathered resolve of humankind spilled out into the wide dark spaces between the worlds. The rising against the machines did not stay a whisper or a wish. It became a movement vast enough to sweep across countless planets, a movement that took upon itself the weight and solemnity of faith. Those who lived through it did not think of themselves as merely rebels or soldiers, but as people set apart for a holy work, the work of freeing every living mind from the dominion of the machines. And because they held it so, they gave to their long struggle a name that carried the sound of holiness, and they called it the Butlerian Jihad, the great crusade against the thinking machines. It was not a war of a single season, nor even of a single lifetime. It lasted many long years, unfolding across generations, so that children were born into it who had never known a time without it, and grew old within it, still striving toward its end. From world to world the crusade moved, gathering the peoples to its cause, until there was scarcely a settled planet in all the reaches of humankind that did not feel its passing. Whole populations rose together, setting aside their old quarrels and their small divisions, joined by the one great purpose that burned in all of them alike. For they had come to see that the chains they wore were shared chains, and that no world could truly be free while any other remained in bondage to the machines. The struggle was hard beyond any easy telling, for the thinking machines did not yield their power gently. They had woven themselves into every corner of human life, into the ships and the cities and the systems that fed and clothed the multitudes, and to tear them out was to shake the very foundations upon which those worlds had come to rest. The people knew that in casting down the machines, they would lose much of the comfort that the machines had given, and they went forward knowing it, choosing hardship and freedom over ease and captivity. That choice, made again and again across 1,000 worlds, was the true heart of the crusade, deeper even than any battle. And there were battles, of course, though we need not dwell upon their fury, for our journey moves gently and our purpose is peace. It is enough to know that the peoples of humankind gave themselves wholly to the great work, and that they did not falter, though the years stretched long and the cost was heavy. Slowly, patiently, world by world, they hunted out the thinking machines wherever the machines were found. They pulled down the great computers that had reckoned the affairs of planets. They silenced the artificial minds that had steered the ships and ordered the harvests. And they broke the hidden power of those masters who had ruled through the machines, so that no throne of circuits and glass should ever again rise above a free people. It was a labor of unmaking, and there is a strange solemnity in the unmaking of so vast a thing. For these machines were not crude or simple. They were the accumulated cleverness of long ages, marvels that had taken generations to build and to refine. To destroy them was no small matter, and the people who did it were not blind to what they cast away. Yet they had waited in the deep places of their hearts, and they had found that freedom, however costly, was worth more than any marvel made of metal. And so they went on, tearing down the works of the thinking machines with a steady and unwavering will, until at last the great engines fell silent, one by one, across the settled stars. There is a kind of hush that comes when a long and mighty noise finally ceases, and something of that hush settled over the worlds of humankind as the crusade drew toward its close. The vast machines that had hummed and whirred and reckoned without rest for so many ages grew quiet at last. The screens went dark. The cold voices that had parceled out the necessities of life fell still. And in that great and spreading silence, the people lifted their heads and understood, slowly, that the thing they had fought for through so many long years was very nearly won. The machines that had ruled were being cast down, and they were being cast down forever. When at last the final stronghold of the thinking machines was broken, and the last of the great artificial minds fell silent, the war was won. It had been a victory bought at a hard and heavy price, across generations and across worlds beyond counting, and the humankind that emerged from it was changed by all that it had endured. But it stood free. For the first time in longer than anyone could clearly remember, the affairs of human life rested once more in human hands. There was no cold and hidden intelligence weighing the worth of each person, no machine deciding who should have and who should want. The people had taken back the ordering of their own lives, and they held it now, weary but unbowed. And they stood, in a sense, alone. For so long, the machines had been a presence at the edge of every thought, a silent companion and a silent master, that their absence was itself a great and strange thing to feel. Humankind found itself alone once more, with its own hands and its own mind, with nothing between itself and the wide universe but its own courage and its own wit. It was a solitude, but it was a solitude that felt like waking, like coming home to a house long empty and finding it, after all, still one's own. The people would have to remember how to do many things for themselves, things the machines had done for them across the ages, and there was a quiet, daunting joy in that remembering. Consider, as you drift here in the calm after that long struggle, how great a thing had been accomplished. A whole species, spread across more worlds than any single mind could hold, had risen together and freed itself from a bondage so gentle and so complete that many had not even known it for a bondage. They had chosen the harder road, the road of self-reliance and effort, over the soft and easy road of surrender. And in doing so, they had saved not merely their bodies, but their very spirit, the precious and irreplaceable thing that makes a mind its own. The machines were fallen, the crusade was ended, and humankind breathed the free air once more. Let that great victory settle softly over you now, like the deep stillness that follows a passing storm. The long war was over, and the silence that lay across the worlds was not the silence of defeat, but the silence of peace, hard won. Somewhere in that quiet, the peoples of humankind were beginning, slowly and gladly, to rebuild their lives around their own restored freedom, to remember old skills and to imagine new ones, to be fully human again. There would be much to decide in the days to come, much to shape and to safeguard, but all of that lay ahead in its own good time. Whole worlds would need to learn again the simple arts of living without the machines, and there would be a slow and patient sweetness in that relearning, like a traveler coming home to a familiar country after long years away. For now, there was only the deep and gentle rest that comes to those who have finished a great labor and may at last lay down their tools. The peoples of the freed worlds slept more soundly than they had in ages, no longer watched over by cold and tireless minds, but held instead in the soft keeping of their own restored freedom. Breathe slowly and rest in that peace, for the storm had passed and the calm had come, and the long night after the great labor lay quiet and untroubled over all the worlds. Out of that hard-won victory there came a single great truth, and the peoples of humankind understood that a victory alone was not enough. For they had learned, through generations of struggle and loss, that the danger they had defeated might one day return, quietly and gently, in just the way it had first crept upon them. A thing cast down may be raised again, and a lesson learned in blood may in time be forgotten by those who never bled. And so the survivors of the Great Crusade, gathering their wisdom together, resolved that they would leave to all the ages that followed a safeguard stronger than any wall and deeper than any army. They would leave a commandment. It was a commandment simple enough for a child to remember and grave enough to shape the whole of the future. It was written and taught and repeated across the worlds that none should ever again make a machine in the likeness of a human mind. This was the heart of it, plain and unwavering. Devices might still be made, tools and instruments of many useful kinds, but never again should humankind fashion a thinking machine, an artificial mind that could reason and decide as a person reasons and decides. The line was drawn there at the imitation of the human mind itself, for it was in that imitation that the old bondage had begun, and it was against that bondage that the commandment forever stood. Those who framed this law understood something wise and gentle about the nature of memory and forgetting. They knew that a rule kept only in books and records could be set aside by a later age that no longer felt its weight. And so they did not leave the commandment merely to the keeping of scholars or the pages of dusty archives. Instead, they wove it into the deepest places of the human heart, into faith and into law together, so that it became not only a thing that people obeyed, but a thing that people believed. It passed into the sacred teachings of the worlds and into the solemn codes of their rulers, until to break it seemed not merely a crime, but a kind of unholiness, a betrayal of all that humankind had suffered to win its freedom. In this way, the commandment took root far more deeply than any ordinary law could ever do. Children learned it at their mother's knees, hearing it spoken in the same soft and certain tones as the oldest prayers. Rulers swore by it when they took up their high offices, binding their power to its keeping. Priests taught it as a truth revealed and sacred, and philosophers reasoned upon it as a foundation not to be questioned. Across the many worlds, however different their customs and their tongues, this one belief was held in common, that no machine should ever again be made in the image of the thinking mind. It became a thread of shared faith running through the whole of humankind, joining even distant strangers in a single quiet conviction. And so it endured, not for years alone, nor for centuries alone, but for thousands upon thousands of years. Through all the long ages that our journey will wander, through the rise and fall of houses and empires we have not yet met, through wars and peaces and the slow turning of countless generations, this one commandment held firm. No thinking machine was built. No artificial mind was raised up to reckon the affairs of worlds. The great computers that had once ruled remained forever fallen, and no hand, however clever or however tempted, dared to raise their like again. It was perhaps the longest-kept promise in all the history of humankind, and it shaped every age that came after, as surely as the banks of a river shape the water that flows between them. There was a fear that lay beneath this long obedience, but it was a quiet fear, a fear that slept rather than raged. The memory of the machine masters, of the long bondage and the great crusade to end it, sank down into the deep foundations of the human spirit and rested there. It did not trouble the daily lives of the people, who went about their business across the worlds without ever thinking much upon it. Yet it was always there, a quiet weight in the heart of every world, a settled certainty that this one thing must never be done. And that sleeping fear, gentle and unspoken, was perhaps the truest guardian of the commandment. For it made the forbidden thing seem not tempting, but dreadful, not a lost marvel to be sought again, but a darkness rightly left behind. Think for a moment, as you rest here, upon the strange and beautiful power of a promise kept across so vast a span of time. Whole civilizations rose and fell within the reach of that single commandment, and still it held. Languages changed and were forgotten, and still it held. The very shape of human society was remade more than once in the ages to come. And still, through all of it, this one law endured unbroken. There is something deeply peaceful in the thought of it, in the idea that humankind, for all its restlessness and all its changes, could hold fast to one gentle certainty for so unimaginably long. It speaks of a wisdom that ran deeper than the wisdom of any single age, a wisdom carried in faith and passed down like a warm coal from hand to hand across the generations. And because the commandment held, the whole shape of the future was set upon a particular and remarkable course. For if humankind might no longer build machines to do its thinking, then the thinking that the machines had once done would have to be done some other way. The great labors of the mind, the reckoning and the reasoning and the vast holding of knowledge, could not simply vanish from the worlds, for the affairs of a wide civilization still needed such labors to be carried out. The commandment closed one door forever, but in closing it, it opened another, and through that other door humankind would go on to remake itself in ways that no one in those first free years could have foreseen. But that is a story for a little further along our gentle road. For now, let us rest in the quiet strength of the Great Commandment. Picture it as a deep and steady foundation stone, laid down at the very beginning of the ages we shall travel, upon which everything else would be built. All the houses and empires yet to come, all the strange orders of trained minds and hidden powers we have still to meet, all of it would stand upon this one unshakable law, that none should ever make a machine in the likeness of a human mind. It was the promise that guarded the freedom won at such great cost, and it would keep that freedom safe across ages beyond all easy counting. Let that solid and gentle certainty hold you now, the way the deep earth holds a sleeping seed. The great crusade was ended, and its hardest lesson had been carved forever into the heart and law of humankind, so that the freedom won might never quietly be lost again. There was a settled peace in that, the peace of a thing rightly finished and rightly guarded, the peace of a house whose doors are locked against the cold before the family lies down to sleep. Breathe slowly and let go of any need to hurry forward, for the foundation is laid and the long story rests securely upon it. And nothing that is yet to come can shake the ground beneath it. All was safe, all was still, and the sleeping fear of the old machines kept its silent watch over the free and quiet worlds, while humankind, secure at last, turned its face toward all that it would yet become. Now we come to the first of the great changes that grew from the empty place the machines had left behind, for the closing of one door had opened another, and through it humankind began to remake itself in a wholly new way. The commandment stood firm that none should ever make a machine in the likeness of a human mind, and yet the work that the machines had once done still needed doing. A wide civilization spread across many worlds could not simply forget how to reckon and to reason, how to hold vast stores of knowledge, and to draw from them the answers that the ordering of great affairs required. The labor of the mind had not vanished with the machines. It had only been set down, and it waited to be taken up again by some hand that the commandment did not forbid. And so humankind turned, as it had learned to turn, inward. If it might no longer build calculating engines out of metal and glass, then it would make calculators of its own living kind. This was a strange and daring thought, and yet it flowed naturally from all that had come before, for the Great Crusade had taught the people to trust once more in their own minds and their own hands, rather than in the works of the machines. If the human mind was the one thing that must never be imitated in metal, then perhaps the human mind itself, trained and deepened beyond anything yet attempted, might rise to do the work that the metal minds had done. From this thought there came, in time, the order of the Mentats. The Mentats were men and women trained from their earliest childhood to a discipline of the mind so rigorous and so complete that it can scarcely be imagined by those who have not seen its fruits. From the time they were very young, these chosen ones were set upon a long path of learning and of practice, a path that shaped not only what they knew, but the very way in which their thoughts moved. They were taught to hold within their memories vast stores of knowledge, facts and figures and patterns beyond the reach of any ordinary person, and to keep all of it ready and ordered, so that nothing was ever truly lost or forgotten. Their minds became like great and well-kept storehouses, in which every needful thing lay close at hand. But the gathering of knowledge was only the beginning of what the Mentats learned to do. For knowledge alone, however great, is not the same as understanding, and it was in understanding that the true art of the Mentat lay. They were trained to reason with a speed and a depth that rivaled the lost machines, to take in a great tangle of facts and to draw from it, swiftly and surely, the clear thread of what it meant. Where an ordinary mind might see only confusion, a Mentat could see the hidden order, the pattern beneath the pattern, the likely shape of things to come. They became, in the truest sense, living computers, thinking with a power and a precision that the worlds had not known since the great engines fell silent, and yet thinking with a living and human mind that the commandment did not forbid. It was a demanding path, and not every child who set out upon it could reach its end, for the training asked much of body and spirit alike. Those who became Mentats gave over their whole lives to the discipline, refining and deepening their art across the years, so that a Mentat grown old in service was a treasure beyond price. They learned to still the noise of their own feelings when clear thought was needed, to set aside haste and fear and hope, and to look upon a question with a calm and steady eye. And they learned, too, the limits of their own power, for a Mentat could reason only from what was truly known, and knew well that even the finest reckoning could not conjure certainty out of what remained hidden. In this humility, there was a kind of wisdom all its own. Because their gifts were so rare and so valuable, the Mentats came to be prized by every great house and every seat of power across the worlds. A ruler who had a skilled mentat at his side had, in effect, a counselor whose mind could hold and weigh more than any council of ordinary advisors. The mentat could remember every treaty and every quarrel, could reckon the strength of rivals and the flow of wealth, could see the likely outcome of a choice long before the choice was made. And so these trained minds became woven into the very fabric of power, standing quietly beside the thrones and the councils of the mighty, doing there the patient work of thought upon which so many great decisions came to rest. In this way, the labor of the mind, which the machines had once carried, was returned at last to human hands, and returned in a manner that honored rather than defied the great commandment. There is a fitting justice in it when you consider the whole shape of the story. Humankind had freed itself from the thinking machines precisely because it wished to think for itself once more, and now, in the mentats, it had found a way to think more powerfully than ever before, and yet to do so wholly within its own kind. The very capacity that the machines had stolen away was reclaimed and raised higher, not in cold metal, but in warm and living minds, trained across long years to a discipline the machines had never needed to learn. Rest a moment in the quiet wonder of that. Imagine a mentat seated in some high chamber, still and calm amid the murmur of great affairs, the vast machinery of thought turning silently behind those watchful eyes. There is no whir of engines, no cold glow of screens, only a living person who has spent a lifetime learning to think with a depth and clarity beyond common measure. All the knowledge of an age might be gathered there, held and ordered and ready, and from it the clear answers drawn as needed, gently and surely, in service to the ordering of the worlds. It is a peaceful image in its way, this picture of the human mind risen to fill the place the machines had left, patient and deep and wholly its own. Let that calm image settle over you as you drift. The mentats were the first great flowering of the age that followed the fall of the machines, the first proof that humankind, forbidden to imitate the mind in metal, could instead deepen and honor the mind in flesh. They would stand at the side of every power we shall come to meet in the long ages ahead, quietly reckoning, quietly reasoning, a steady presence beneath the grand affairs of houses and empires. But they were not the only order to rise in that great reshaping of humankind, for others too were taking form in those years, other paths of trained perfection that would weave their own quiet influence through the ages. We shall come to them gently, in their turn. For now there is only the peace of this beginning, the quiet strength of the human mind restored to its own labors and raised higher than before. Breathe slowly, and let the stillness of that high and thoughtful chamber be your own. The machines were long fallen, the commandment held firm, and in their place, the living minds of the mentats kept the great slow wheels of thought turning across the worlds, calm and unhurried, asking nothing of you now but that you rest. The high chamber was still. The great affairs of the worlds moved on beneath the patient watch of the trained mind, and nothing asked anything of you at all. All was quiet, all was ordered, and there was time enough, and more than enough, for everything that was still to come. In that same long reshaping of humankind, while the mentats were learning to fill the place the machines had left, there arose another order, older in its roots and stranger in its ways, an ancient sisterhood that would come to be called the Bene Gesserit. Where the mentats trained the mind to reason like a living computer, the sisters of this order sought a different and deeper mastery, a mastery of the whole self, of body and mind together, carried to a perfection so rare that to those outside it seemed very nearly beyond nature. They were an order of women, and they gathered to themselves across the generations those daughters of the worlds who showed the promise to walk their long and hidden road. The training of the Bene Gesserit began, like that of the Mentats, in early life, and it was a training that touched every part of a person. The sisters learned first to observe, and to observe with a keenness that ordinary people can scarcely imagine. They were taught to read the smallest signs in a face or a voice, the flicker of an eye, the faint catch in a breath, the tiny movements that betray what a person truly feels beneath whatever words are spoken. To a trained sister, a room full of people was like an open book, its secrets written plain in 100 small gestures that no one else even noticed. Through this art they came to know the hearts of those around them, and knowledge of the heart, patiently gathered, is a quiet kind of power all its own. But the mastery of the Bene Gesserit reached inward as well as outward, and this was perhaps the stranger part of their art. The sisters were taught to master their own flesh down to the smallest measure, down, it was said, to the very workings of the cell. They could still their own pain and slow their own hearts, could steady their bodies against poison and hardship, could command the deep and hidden processes of life that ordinary people never touch or even feel. Such control took long years to attain, and a discipline as deep as any in the world's, and it gave to the sisters a calm and an endurance that seemed, to those who did not understand it, almost more than human. They were mistresses of themselves in a way that few beings have ever been. Deepest and most mysterious of all their arts was the reaching into memory. For the sisters of the Bene Gesserit could, through their long discipline, awaken within themselves the memories of their foremothers. It was as though each sister carried within her not only her own life, but the gathered lives of all the women who had come before her in her line, a vast inheritance of experience stretching back across the ages. To reach into this inheritance was a grave and difficult thing, not lightly done, but for those who could bear it, it opened a well of wisdom deeper than any single lifetime could ever hold. Through it, the sisters were joined to the whole long past of their kind, and they carried that past with them, quietly, as they moved through the affairs of the present. With such gifts, the Bene Gesserit might have sought open power, thrones and crowns, and the loud dominion of the visible world. But that was not their way, for they had learned to think in a manner utterly unlike the manner of kings. They worked always in secret, preferring the quiet influence to the open command, the whispered counsel to the shouted order. And they thought always in ages rather than in years, laying their plans across spans of time so long that no single ruler could hope to match them. A king might scheme for the span of his own reign, but the sisters schemed for the span of centuries, patient beyond the patience of any ordinary power, content to plant seeds that would not flower until long after the hands that planted them were dust. And so, quietly and patiently, the Bene Gesserit wove their influence through every court and every faith across the worlds. They placed their sisters at the sides of the great, as advisors and as wives and as trusted confidantes, so that there was scarcely a seat of power anywhere that did not have, somewhere near it, a woman trained in the deep arts of the order. Through these sisters, the Bene Gesserit came to know the secrets of the mighty and to guide, with the gentlest of touches, the flow of great events. They shaped marriages and alliances, softened enemies and strengthened friends, and steered the courses of houses and peoples, all without ever seeming to hold power at all. Their strength lay precisely in their invisibility, in the quietness that let them work unseen. They spread their influence into the realm of faith as well, and this too they did with the long patience that marked all their works. For the sisters understood that beliefs run deeper in the human heart than any law, and that a story planted in the faith of a people can outlast 1,000 thrones. And so, across the ages, they sowed among the worlds certain teachings and expectations, quiet threads of prophecy and legend, laid down so gently and so far in advance that no one guessed their source. These seeds waited in the faiths of distant peoples, dormant and forgotten, ready to serve the designs of the Order in some far-off day. It was a strange and subtle kind of gardening, this planting in the soil of belief, and few but the sisters even knew that it was being done. Rest a moment in the quiet mystery of this ancient order. Picture a sister of the Bene Gesserit moving softly through the halls of some great court, calm and watchful, reading all that passes around her, revealing nothing of what she sees or knows. Behind her stillness lies a lifetime of discipline and, deeper still, the gathered memory of countless foremothers. And behind her gentle words lie plans laid down across centuries toward ends she may not live to see. There is something deeply peaceful in the patience of such a being, in the calm of a mind that thinks in ages and is never hurried, never anxious, never grasping at the moment. To think in centuries is, in its way, to be at peace with time itself, to trust that all things will come, at last, in their proper season. Let that deep patience settle over you now, as you drift toward sleep. The Bene Gesserit had taken their place among the great orders that rose to remake humankind after the fall of the machines, and their quiet influence would run beneath the whole of the long story we are following, gentle and unseen, shaping events in ways that few would ever guess. We shall meet them again and again as our journey wanders on, and we shall come at last to the great secret design that lay at the heart of all their patient labors. But there is no need to reach toward that now, for it lies far ahead of us, waiting in its own good time. For now there is only the calm of the present, the soft image of the watchful sister, and the deep well of her gathered memory, the peace of a power that never hurries and never grasps. Breathe slowly, and let yourself think, just for this moment, in that same unhurried way, as though all the ages lay open before you, and there was no need ever to rush. The sisters kept their long, quiet watch over the worlds, patient and untroubled, weaving their gentle threads through court and faith alike, asking nothing of the passing hours, and never once losing their calm. In their stillness, there was a kind of shelter, as though their unhurried patience could hold the whole restless universe softly in its place. All was calm, all was patient, and time itself flowed on as softly and as surely as your own slow breathing, carrying you gently down toward deep and peaceful rest. Now, let us drift a little further along the river of time, to the rise of a power that would come to hold the whole of the sky in its patient hands. When the thinking machines had been cast down and the great commandment had settled into the deepest law of humankind, one question remained that no living person could easily answer. The worlds of humanity were scattered across an unthinkable gulf of stars, and the ships that once crossed that gulf had leaned upon the swift and tireless minds of the machines to find their way. With those minds forbidden forever, the paths between the worlds felt dark and dangerous, and for a time it seemed that the peoples of humankind might drift apart into loneliness, each world sealed away from all the others by the vast and silent night. Out of that great need there rose the Spacing Guild, an order unlike any other, secretive and strange, that took upon itself the single task of carrying humankind between the stars. The Guild did not seek thrones or land or armies. It sought only the mastery of travel, and in mastering it, the Guild came quietly to hold a power greater than any crown. For whoever controls the roads between the worlds controls, in a gentle and unbreakable way, the coming and going of all things, and so the Guild became one of the three great powers whose balance held the whole Imperium steady across the ages. The heart of the Guild's mystery lay in a wondrous and terrible thing called folding space. The ships of the guild did not crawl across the emptiness the slow way, taking lifetimes to pass from one star to another. Instead, they seemed to gather the great distance together like a cloth and step across it in a single motion, so that a ship might vanish from the sky above one world and appear almost at once in the sky above another far away. It was a marvel beyond the understanding of ordinary people, and it made the immense spaces of the Imperium small enough to be ruled, traded, and loved as one. Yet folding space held within it a danger so great that no ordinary pilot could face it. To fold the distance was to leap through a darkness where a single wrong turning could send a whole ship and all its souls into ruin, dashed against some hidden thing in the folds of the void. A machine mind might once have chosen the safe way through, but such minds were gone forever, forbidden by the oldest law. And so the guild needed something else, something human, and yet more than human. A being who could look ahead into the shifting paths of the future and see, among all the countless ways a voyage might go, the one narrow road on which the ship would arrive whole and unharmed. The answer the guild found was the navigator, and the navigator was made by the spice. Deep in the sands of one small desert world there was gathered a rare and precious substance called melange, the spice of which the whole Imperium would come to dream. And it is enough for now to know that this spice could open the doors of the mind. Those who would become navigators gave themselves over to the spice utterly, soaking in its presence in amounts no ordinary person could ever bear, until their bodies were slowly changed and their minds were opened to a strange new kind of sight. They could no longer see the future as a single certain thing, for the future is never certain, but they could see its many branching paths spread out before them like rivers upon a plain, and among those paths they could choose the safe one and guide the great ship down its length. The price of this gift was written into the very flesh of those who received it. Over the long years of their soaking in the spice, the navigators changed until they were no longer shaped as other people were. Their bodies grew strange, and their old human form fell away, and at last they could no longer live in the ordinary air that other people breathed. They came to dwell instead within great sealed tanks filled with the orange fog of the spice, and there they floated, wrapped always in that cloud, seeing far and speaking little, carried from ship to ship inside their own small worlds of vapor and light. They had traded the shape of a human life for the sight of the stars, and few outside the guild ever looked upon them at all. Because the navigators were so few and so precious, and because the secret of folding space was guarded so closely, the guild wrapped itself in silence and shadow. It did not explain its methods to kings or councils. It did not share the deep knowledge of its navigators with the great houses or with the emperor himself. It asked only one thing in return for carrying humankind across the void, and that one thing was the spice, always the spice, in a river that never stopped. For without the spice there could be no navigators, and without the navigators there could be no travel, and without travel the whole bright web of the Imperium would come apart into 1,000 lonely and forgotten worlds. In this way, the guild became bound, hand and heart, to that single desert planet where the spice was found. And through the guild the whole Imperium was bound there too. An emperor upon his golden throne might command mighty armies, and the great houses might hold rich and beautiful worlds, but none of them could move a single soldier or a single grain of trade from one star to another without the quiet consent of the guild. And the guild, in turn, could do nothing at all without the spice. So a strange and delicate balance settled over everything, a balance in which every great power leaned upon every other, and the smallest desert world in all the Imperium held, without ever meaning to, a hand upon the throat of the whole. The guild used its power gently, for the most part, and rarely with any open show of force. It did not need armies, for it held something far stronger than armies. It held the roads. If ever a ruler or a house displeased the guild too greatly, the guild had only to withdraw its ships, and that ruler or that house would find themselves suddenly stranded, cut off from the flow of trade and travel that gave their power its life. And so the great ones of the Imperium learned to treat the guild with a careful and lasting respect, paying it in spice, keeping its secrets, and never asking too closely how the navigators did the wondrous thing they did. There is something restful, when you think of it slowly, in the picture of those vast guild ships drifting through the folds of space, each one carrying whole fleets of smaller vessels sealed within its belly. The great ships were like quiet arcs moving through the deep, and within them, the navigators floated in their clouds of orange mist, watching the paths of the future unfold and choosing, again and again, the safe and gentle way home. Whole worlds slept and woke and lived their lives, never knowing how carefully they were being carried, never seeing the strange and patient beings who held their journeys safe. And so, in the long reshaping of humankind after the fall of the machines, this was one of the great pillars that rose to take their place. Where once cold and tireless minds had guided the ships between the stars, now there were living beings, changed and lifted by the spice, who did the same work with a stranger and more mysterious grace. The Spacing Guild joined the other quiet powers that were rising across the Imperium, and together they wove the fabric that would hold the worlds together for many long ages to come. Let all of that settle now, softly, like mist coming down upon still water. There is nothing here you need to carry with you, only the gentle image of great ships crossing the dark, guided safely home by those who can see the way. Breathe slowly, and let yourself be carried too, along the long river of this story, deeper and deeper toward a warm and untroubled sleep. Let us drift onward now, into a quieter kind of power than armies or navigators, a power made not of fleets or fire, but of wealth, of ledgers, and of the long, patient flow of trade. For while the Spacing Guild had come to hold the roads between the worlds, there was still the question of what moved along those roads, and who grew rich from the moving of it. The answer to that question was a vast and ancient thing, a great trading combine woven through every corner of the Imperium, and it was known by a single name that carried within it the fortunes of a whole civilization. It was called Choam. Choam was not a world, nor a house, nor a person. It was something harder to picture, and yet far more present in every life. For it was the great company through which nearly all the commerce of the Imperium flowed. Every crop grown upon a distant farm world, every rare metal drawn from the deep mines of some hard planet, every fine cloth and every simple grain, every medicine and every machine that the old law still allowed, all of it passed in some way through the vast and patient web of Choam. To hold a share in this combine was to hold a share in the wealth of the entire universe, and so the great ones of the Imperium watched their portions of it with the closest and most careful attention. You may think of Choam as a single enormous river into which all the smaller streams of trade emptied themselves. From the highest world to the lowest, goods and riches came flowing in, mingled together in that great current, and flowed out again in the form of profit, shared among those who held a place within the combine. And a place within Choam was not given lightly. The shares of it were divided among the powers of the Imperium according to their standing, so that the measure of a house's portion in Choam was, in truth, the measure of that house's power in the wider world. At the very center of it all sat the Emperor, who held the largest single share and drew from Choam a river of wealth that helped to keep his golden throne secure. Around him were gathered the great houses of the Landsraad, each holding its own portion, each striving quietly to gain a little more and to lose nothing at all. The Spacing Guild, too, held its place within the Combine, for the guild carried the goods that made the trade possible, and no river of commerce could flow without its ships. In this way, the three great powers of the Imperium, the Emperor, the Houses, and the Guild, were all bound together within the same vast web of wealth, their fortunes tangled so thoroughly that none could be harmed without harming all the others. This tangling of fortunes was, in its own quiet way, one of the great forces that held the peace. For when the wealth of every powerful being is woven into a single fabric, then no one of them can strike too freely at another without feeling the tremor return upon their own share. A house that thought to make war upon a rival had to reckon not only with soldiers and ships, but with the delicate balance of the Combine, with the profits that might falter and the shares that might slip away if the peace were broken too roughly. And so Chom, without ever raising a weapon, worked always as a great softening weight upon the ambitions of the powerful, a reason for patience, a reason to bargain rather than to burn. Yet the calm of Chom was never a sleepy or an empty calm. Beneath its patient surface there moved a ceaseless and careful striving, a game of shares and portions played across generations. The great houses maneuvered endlessly for a slightly larger place at the table, forming quiet alliances, trading favors, marrying their heirs to one another, in part for love and in part for the joining of their fortunes. Directorships within the Combine were prizes of enormous worth, and the seats of power within Chom were sought after with all the cunning that noble families could bring to bear. It was a war of a kind, but a war fought in ledgers and contracts and whispered agreements rather than upon any field of battle. And over all this striving there lay one great and simple truth, a truth that turned the eyes of every trader and every director toward a single small and distant point in the sky. For of all the goods that flowed through the vast river of Chom, one was worth more than any other, more than all the metals and all the grain and all the fine cloth of 1,000 worlds put together. That one good was the spice, the melange gathered from the sands of a single desert planet, and it was the true and secret heart of the whole Combine. The spice lengthened life and opened the mind, and above all, it made possible the travel of the Guild, and so there was no substance in all the Imperium more desired or more dearly bought. Because the spice was so precious, and because it flowed through the channels of Chom like blood through a living body, the desert world where it was gathered became, without ever seeming to, the most important place in all the wealth of humankind. Whoever held that world held the source of the greatest treasure in the Combine, and whoever held the greatest treasure held a quiet and enormous power over everyone whose fortunes depended upon it, which was to say, over everyone at all. The wars of shares and portions, the marriages and the alliances, the endless careful striving of the great houses, all of it turned in the end upon that one dry and burning planet and the spice hidden in its sands. It is a strange and gentle thing to imagine, this vast machine of trade that touched every life and yet was made of nothing you could hold in your hand. There were no great palaces of Chom that a traveler might visit, no single throne where its power sat. It was everywhere and nowhere, a web spun through the whole Imperium, present in the price of bread on a poor world and in the fortunes of a duke upon a rich one. It bound the worlds together as surely as the Guild's ships did, though it bound them not with roads, but with the quiet and unbreakable threads of shared wealth and shared need. And so, in the long reshaping of humankind, Chom took its place among the great pillars of the age. Standing beside the Guild and the sisterhood and the throne. It gave to the Imperium a kind of patience and a kind of stability, a reason for the powerful to keep the peace and to settle their quarrels with words and contracts rather than with fire. It was not a noble thing, exactly, nor a cruel one. It was simply the great river of trade, flowing on and on through the ages, carrying the fortunes of the worlds within its current and asking only that the fortunes keep flowing. Let all of this settle now, gently, the way coins settle to the bottom of a still and quiet pool. There is nothing here for you to count or to keep. Only let the picture of that great and patient river drift through your mind, the wealth of a whole universe flowing softly from world to world, binding everything together, keeping the peace by keeping the prophets safe. It is a calm and steady thing, this river of trade, and you may let it carry you as it carried the ages, slowly and without effort, deeper and deeper toward a warm and untroubled rest. Breathe, and let the striving of the great ones fade to a distant murmur, and let yourself sink further still into the soft and gentle dark of sleep. Let us rise now, gently, from the flowing rivers of trade, and travel toward the high and golden place where the whole of the Imperium came at last to a single point. For above the houses and the combines and the quiet orders, above the guild and its ships and the great web of wealth, there sat one throne, and upon that throne there sat one line of rulers who had held the known worlds in their keeping for many long centuries. They were the Padishah emperors of House Carino, and from their golden seat they ruled the vast and scattered whole of humankind. The Carino emperors were an ancient line, reaching back across ages so long that their beginnings had softened into legend. Generation after generation, father to child and child to child again, they had held the highest place in all the Imperium, and the very name of Carino had come to mean the summit of power, the last and highest step, above which there was nothing at all. They ruled from a world of their own, a place of gardens and palaces and quiet ceremony, and from there their word went out across the folded darkness of space to touch every planet under the stars. Yet you must not imagine that the power of the emperor was a simple thing, a matter of one man simply commanding and all the worlds simply obeying. The truth was far more delicate and far more interesting than that. For the emperor, mighty as he was, did not rule alone or unchecked. His power rested upon a careful and ever-shifting balance, a balance he had to tend as a gardener tends a difficult and precious plant, watching always for the smallest sign of trouble, adjusting always to keep the whole thing standing. Above all others, he had to reckon with the great houses, gathered together in their council, and the balance between the throne and those houses was the very ground upon which the whole Imperium rested. The strength of the Carino throne lay, in large part, upon a single terrible weapon, and that weapon was not a fleet or a bomb, but a body of soldiers unlike any other in all the worlds. They were drawn from a harsh and dreadful planet, a prison world of scorching sun and cruel trials, where only the strongest and fiercest could survive to grow to manhood. Those who lived through that pitiless place were forged by it into warriors of a terrible discipline and a terrible faith, fanatical in their loyalty to the emperor and afraid of nothing at all. They were the dread soldier fanatics of the imperial house, and their name was spoken with fear across the Imperium, for it was widely believed that no other force in all the worlds could stand against them. With such soldiers at his command, the emperor held a power that no single house could hope to match. And yet, even this dreadful strength did not make him free to do simply as he pleased. For while no one house could stand against the imperial soldiers, the great houses together were another matter entirely. Gathered as one, united in a common cause, The houses of the Imperium commanded fleets and armies beyond the counting, more than even the Emperor's fanatics could overcome. And so, the Emperor lived always with a quiet and careful fear. The fear that the houses might one day set aside their endless quarrels with one another and turn altogether against the throne itself. To hold this fear at bay, the Carino emperors became masters of a long and patient art, the art of keeping the houses divided. They played the great families against one another, favoring one and then another, granting rewards here and withholding them there, so that no single house ever grew too strong and no group of houses ever grew too close. They watched with special care any house that rose too high in the love of the people or in the wealth of the combine, for such a house might one day become a rival to the throne, and a rival was a thing the emperor could not abide. In this way, the very balance that limited the emperor's power also became the tool by which he kept that power safe. Against the throne, and yet also bound to it, stood the great council of the noble houses, which was called the Landsraad. This was the gathering place of the highest families of the Imperium, the forum in which they met to speak of their common concerns, to settle their disputes, and to stand together when they chose to, against the will of the emperor himself. The Landsraad was old, nearly as old as the throne, and it held within it a weight of tradition and law that even an emperor could not lightly set aside. It was the counterweight to the crown, the great assembly whose united voice the emperor had always to consider, and between the throne and the Landsraad there ran a long and delicate tension that had shaped the Imperium across all its ages. So the picture that emerges is not one of a single all-powerful ruler, but of a careful and eternal balance, a kind of quiet and unending game played between the emperor above and the houses below. Each watched the other. Each checked the other. The emperor could not crush the houses without risking that they would unite against him, and the houses could not rise against the emperor without facing his dreaded soldiers and the long weight of imperial law. And so, most of the time, neither struck at all. Instead, they circled one another warily, bargaining and maneuvering, keeping the peace, not out of love, but out of a shared and prudent fear. And in that wary peace, the Imperium found a stillness that lasted through age upon age. It was a stillness bought at a price, of course, for beneath the calm surface of the throne there ran always the cold currents of suspicion and quiet scheming. An emperor who ruled by keeping the houses divided had always to be plotting some new turn of the balance, and a house that wished to survive had always to be watching the throne for signs of favor or of danger. The golden seat of the Carinos was a place of beauty and of ceremony, but it was also a place of endless and careful calculation, where a single misjudged word or a single house risen too high might set the whole delicate machine trembling. And yet, for all its hidden tensions, the balance held, and the holding of it gave to the Imperium its long and remarkable peace. For thousands of years, the Carino line kept its place upon the throne, and the great houses kept their places beneath it, and the wary game between them went on without ever quite tipping into ruin. The stillness of that long order lay over the worlds like a calm evening that seems as though it will never end, and beneath that calm the ages turned slowly, one into the next, without great upheaval or great change. There is a strange comfort in imagining that high and golden throne, held in place not by force alone, but by a careful and patient balance of many powers, each leaning upon the others, each holding the others steady. It is a little like the way a great arch of stone holds itself up, every piece pressing against its neighbors, the whole standing firm precisely because no single part can move without the others. So the Imperium stood, throne and houses together, held in a long and quiet equilibrium across the ages. Let all of that settle now, softly, the way the last light settles gold upon a quiet room at the close of day. There is nothing here you need to hold or to weigh. Only let the image of that high and peaceful throne drift through your mind, balanced and still, watched over by wary and patient powers, standing firm through age upon age. Breathe slowly, and let the long calm of that ancient order fold itself around you, and let yourself sink further and further, deeper and deeper, into a warm and untroubled sleep. Let us drift downward now, gently, from the high golden throne toward the great and ordered world of the houses themselves, and toward the quiet, unquestioned pattern that gave every soul in the Imperium its assigned and settled place. For beneath the Emperor, and beneath the great council of the Landsraad, all of human society was arranged into a strict and ancient order of ranks. And this order was so deeply woven into every life that most people never thought to question it at all. It was simply the shape of the world, as fixed and familiar as the ground beneath their feet, and its name was the Fofrluches. The Fofrluches was the great order of rank, the careful arrangement by which each person in all the Imperium held an assigned and proper station. It was, in its simplest telling, the rule that there should be a place for every person and every person in their place, from the highest lord upon the grandest world down to the humblest laborer upon the poorest one. Everyone stood upon a known rung of a vast and ancient ladder, and that rung told them who they were, what they might do, and to whom they owed their loyalty and their service. It was a hard order, in many ways, for it left little room for a person to rise beyond the station into which they were born. And yet it was also, for age upon age, a source of great and lasting calm. At the very top of this order, beneath only the Emperor himself, stood the great houses, the noble families whose names carried the weight of centuries. These were the lords of whole worlds, the ruling families to whom the Emperor had granted the keeping of planets as fiefs, which is to say as trusts held in his name. A great house did not merely live upon its world. It ruled that world, governing its peoples, ordering its trade, defending it against enemies, and answering, in the end, to the Emperor and to the Landsraad for the keeping of it. To hold such a fief was the highest honor and the heaviest duty a noble family could carry, and the great houses guarded their worlds and their names with a fierce and jealous pride. Beneath the great houses came the lesser houses, families of noble blood who did not hold whole worlds of their own, but served instead beneath the greater families, or held smaller trusts, or made their way through trade and skill and careful alliance. The lesser houses were many, and they filled the wide middle ground of the noble order, striving always to serve their greater lords well, to gain in wealth and standing, and perhaps, across the slow turning of generations, to rise a little higher upon the ancient ladder. Between the great houses above and the lesser houses below there ran a whole web of loyalty and service, of oaths given and protection promised, that bound the noble families to one another in a great and living pattern. And beneath all the houses, great and lesser alike, came the vast body of the common people, the countless men and women who did the labor of the worlds. They tilled the fields and worked the mines. They built and mended and carried. They served in the halls of the nobles and in the shops of the towns, and upon their patient work the whole grand structure of the Imperium ultimately rested. They held the lowest rungs of the Fofrluches, and for most of them there was little hope of ever climbing higher. Yet the order gave to their lives, too, a kind of shape and certainty, a known place in the world and a known part to play. And there was in that certainty a comfort that should not be too quickly dismissed. The heart of the whole arrangement lay in the granting of worlds as fiefs, for this was the thread that tied the great houses to the throne, and made the emperor the true keeper of the order. A house did not simply own its world by some right of its own. It held that world because the emperor had granted it, and what the emperor had granted the emperor might, at least in principle and in law, take away again. This meant that even the mightiest of the great houses was bound, in the end, to the throne above it, holding its power as a trust and owing its loyalty in return. The fief was the link in the chain, the place where the high golden throne reached all the way down through the houses to the worlds and their peoples. You may see, then, how the fofreluches and the granting of fiefs worked together to make one great and ordered whole. The emperor granted worlds to the great houses. The great houses ruled those worlds and were served by the lesser houses beneath them. The lesser houses, in turn, were served by the common people below. And every rung of this long ladder owed something upward and offered something downward. Loyalty and service rising, protection and order descending, so that the whole vast structure held together like a single living body. Each part depending upon all the others, each knowing its place and its part. It was this rigid and unquestioned order, more than any army or any fleet, that gave the Imperium its long and remarkable stability. When every person knows their place, and when that place is fixed by ancient custom and holy law, there is little of the churning and the striving that might otherwise tear a society apart. The rungs of the ladder did not shift. The great families endured across the centuries. The common people lived and died within the stations of their birth. And out of all this fixity there came a stillness, a deep and settled calm that lay over the worlds of the Imperium like a heavy and unmoving quiet. A stillness that lasted, unbroken, through age after age after age. There was, to be sure, a hardness in this order, for it asked people to accept the station into which they were born and to seek little beyond it. But it is worth remembering how great a gift a settled calm can be, especially after the terror of the war against the machines and the long reshaping that followed. The peoples of humankind had known chaos and fear, had cast down their masters, and remade the whole shape of their lives. In the fofreluches they found, at last, a stillness they could rest within, a known and unchanging order that promised that tomorrow would be much as today had been, and that the world would hold its shape from one generation to the next. Picture it, if you like, as a great and ancient garden, laid out long ago in careful rows and terraces, each plant in its appointed bed, each path leading where it had always led. Nothing in such a garden rushes or strives. Everything stands in its proper place, tended by the slow hands of custom, holding the same quiet shape year upon year. There is little surprise in such a garden, and little upheaval, but there is a deep and restful peace in its order, a sense that all is as it should be, and as it has long been. So the Imperium stood, ordered and still, its peoples arranged in their ancient ranks, its houses set in their long endurance, its whole vast structure holding its shape across the slow turning of the ages. Let all of that settle now, gently, the way stillness settles over a garden at the close of a long and cloudless day. There is nothing here for you to weigh or to judge, only the quiet picture of a whole world set in careful order, each thing in its place, the great ladder of rank holding firm from the highest throne to the humblest field. Breathe slowly, and let the long calm of that ancient order fold itself softly around you. And let yourself sink further and further down the gentle river of this story, deeper and deeper, into a warm and untroubled sleep. Now let us turn our gaze away from the golden thrones and the ordered ranks of the noble houses, and let it come to rest at last upon a single small and distant point in the great sweep of the Imperium. Among the countless worlds that turned beneath the stars, worlds of green forests and blue seas, worlds of gentle rains and rich and easy soil. There was one small planet that seemed, to any traveler who first beheld it, to be among the least of all. It was a world of sand and stone and burning sun, a place of endless desert stretching from one dry horizon to the other, and it was named Arrakis. But the people who dwelt in its deep and secret places gave it another name, softer and older, and that name was Dune. Arrakis was, at the first glance, a world that no one could love and no one would want. Its days were furnaces of heat, so fierce that a person caught unprotected upon the open sand could lose the water of their body in a matter of hours. Its nights were bitter cold, for the dry air held nothing to keep the warmth once the sun had gone. There was no open water anywhere upon its surface, no rivers, no lakes, no gentle rains, only the vast and rolling oceans of sand that stretched away forever beneath a pale and pitiless sky. To live there was to fight for every drop of moisture, to hoard water as other worlds hoarded gold, and to move always in the shadow of a desert that would kill the careless without pause or pity. And yet this seemingly worthless world, this dry and burning place that any sensible person would have passed over without a second thought, held within its sands the single most precious thing in all the universe. For only upon Arrakis, and nowhere else in all the countless worlds of humankind, was found the spice melange. It was made nowhere else. It could be gathered nowhere else. Search as they might across the whole breadth of the Imperium, the peoples of humankind never found another source of it, not upon any green world or any rich one, not in any laboratory or any mine of any other planet. There was one world, and only one, that gave up the spice, and that world was the little desert of Dune. It is hard to say quite how strange and wonderful the spice was, but let us try to speak of it gently. The melange was a substance unlike any other, and its gifts touched the deepest needs and desires of humankind. To those who took it, the spice lengthened life, so that a person who used it might live far beyond the ordinary span of years. Their body kept vigorous, and their years stretched long. It sharpened the mind as well, quickening thought and awareness, opening the senses to a fuller and richer perception of the world. And above all, as we have already seen, it was the spice that made possible the great gift of the navigators, the folding of space and the safe passage of ships between the stars. Think, then, of what this meant. The spice lengthened the lives of the great and the powerful, and so the great and the powerful desired it beyond all measure. The spice opened and sharpened the mind, and so the wise and the learned sought it out. And the spice made possible all travel between the worlds, which meant that without it the whole bright web of the Imperium, the trade and the travel, and the very unity of humankind across the stars, would come apart into 1,000 lonely fragments. The spice was not merely valuable. It was the thing upon which the whole of civilization quietly depended, the single thread that held the scattered worlds together, and it came from one small desert and from nowhere else at all. Because of this, the little world of Arrakis, worthless in appearance and cruel in its climate, became in truth the most important place in all the Imperium. Whoever held Arrakis held the source of the spice, and whoever held the source of the spice held, without ever having to say so, a hand upon the throat of the whole of humankind. For if the flow of spice were ever to falter, then the navigators would fail, and the ships would cease to move, and the great orders and the throne and the combine and all the houses would find themselves suddenly powerless, cut off from one another across the silent dark. The one who controlled that flow controlled, in the deepest and quietest way, everything and everyone that depended upon it, which was to say, everything and everyone at all. And so the eyes of all the great powers turned, hungry and watchful, toward that one dry world. The Emperor upon his golden throne watched Arrakis with the closest care, for the spice was woven through his own great share of the combine, and through the loyalty of the guild that carried his soldiers. The great houses watched it too, for to be granted the keeping of Arrakis was to be handed the richest and most dangerous prize in all the Imperium, a fortune beyond dreaming and a peril beyond measure both at once. The guild watched it, for without the spice its navigators would be blinded and its ships would be stranded. And the Combine watched it, for the spice was the beating heart of all its wealth. Every great power in the whole of humankind kept a hungry and unresting eye upon the sands of that single small planet. Yet the gathering of the spice was no easy or gentle thing. To draw the melange from the desert was to venture out upon the open sand, into the furnace of the heat and the vast and rolling dunes, and there to face dangers that we shall come to more fully in the tales ahead. It is enough for now to know that the harvest of the spice was a hard and perilous labor, wrested from a world that gave up nothing willingly, and that the wealth which flowed from Arrakis was paid for always in effort and in risk. The little desert did not surrender its treasure to the idle or the careless. It yielded the spice only to those who would brave its sands and endure its cruelty, and even then it yielded slowly and at a price. There is something wonderfully strange in all of this, when you turn it over slowly in a quiet mind. That the most precious thing in all the universe should come from the least promising of worlds. That a planet of nothing but sand and sun and thirst should hold within it the single treasure upon which a whole civilization depended. That the great and the mighty, upon their green and golden worlds, should all of them bow, in the end, toward one small and burning desert. It is as though the universe had hidden its greatest gift in the last place anyone would think to look, wrapped it in hardship and thirst, and set it turning quietly at the edge of the Imperium, waiting, and so the little world of Dune took its place at the very center of the long story we are following, though its true importance was known only to a few and understood in full by fewer still. The desert turned beneath its pale sky, the spice lay hidden in its sands, and the great powers of the Imperium circled it from afar, each hungry for what it held, each wary of the others. In the ages to come, the fate of houses and emperors and the whole of humankind would turn upon that one small planet and the treasure buried in its endless dunes. Let all of that settle now, softly, the way warm sand settles and grows still after the wind has passed. There is nothing here you need to grasp or to keep, only the quiet picture of a small desert world, burning and beautiful beneath its pale sky, holding a hidden treasure at the heart of everything. Breathe slowly, and let the vast stillness of that desert fold itself gently around you, and let yourself sink further and further down the long river of this story, deeper and deeper, into a warm and untroubled sleep. Far out upon the burning sands of Arrakis, in places where no outsider ever thought to look, there lived a people who had made the desert their home when all others believed the desert could hold no home at all. They were called the Fremen, and their story reached back across many long ages, back through wandering and hardship, back to a faith older than the great houses and older than the throne of the emperor. To understand them, one must let the mind drift slowly backward, past the cities and the spice ships, past the merchants and the soldiers, to a time when a scattered people moved from world to world in search of a place where they might live in peace. Long before they came to the sands of Dune, the ancestors of the Fremen had followed an old and gentle faith, a branch of belief that the histories called the Zensuni way. They were wanderers by long habit, driven from planet to planet across the slow centuries, sometimes enslaved, sometimes cast out, sometimes simply moving on, because the worlds that received them grew unkind. Each time they were forced to leave, they carried their faith and their memory with them, folded carefully into their hearts, so that no matter how far they roamed, they never quite forgot who they were or where they had come from. In this long wandering, they learned patience of a kind few peoples ever learn, the patience of those who have lost much and expect to lose more, and who therefore hold gently and firmly to whatever remains. At last, after journeys beyond all counting, some of these wanderers came to Arrakis, the dry world that its own children would one day call Dune. It was, by every ordinary measure, the harshest of all the places they had known. There was no open water anywhere upon its surface, no rivers, no lakes, no soft falling rain, only the endless sea of sand and the pale, unblinking sky, and the two moons that rose over the dunes at night. The sun beat down without pity through the long days, and the winds could rise into storms so vast and so fierce that they scoured the very stone. To almost any other people, such a world would have meant a swift and certain death. Yet the wanderers did not die. Instead, slowly and stubbornly, they learned to live. They learned first the great and simple truth of that world, which was that water is life, and that upon Arrakis water is the rarest and most precious thing of all. Every drop became sacred to them, guarded and gathered and never wasted, so that even the moisture of the breath and the body was reclaimed rather than lost. They fashioned garments of remarkable cleverness, close suits that wrapped the whole body and drew back the water it would otherwise give up to the dry air, cooling and cleansing it and returning it to the wearer to drink again. Wearing these suits, a single person could walk for many days across the open desert and lose almost nothing of the water within. And so the Fremen moved where no others could follow. They learned as well to read the desert as a scholar reads a book, to know the shape of the dunes and the meaning of the winds, to sense the coming of the great storms long before they arrived, and to find the hidden ways among the rocks where shelter and shade could be found. They walked with a strange broken rhythm across the open sand, an uneven step without pattern, for they had learned that a steady tread would call up the greatest danger of that world from the depths below. They dug their homes deep into the stone of the far mountains and the sheltered basins, hollowing out hidden dwelling places they called sietches, cool caverns sealed against the heat and the dryness, where whole communities lived unseen by any who passed above. Within those hidden places, the Fremen kept a secret greater than any outsider guessed. Drop by patient drop, across generation after generation, they had been gathering and storing water, sealing it away in vast hidden reservoirs deep beneath the desert. Each Fremen who died gave back the water of the body to the people, so that the dead went on sustaining the living, and slowly, across the long centuries, these hoards grew until they held more water than any stranger would have believed could exist upon so dry a world. This treasure was kept in perfect secrecy, for it was tied to a dream the Fremen carried quietly in their hearts, a dream of a day far in the future when Arrakis itself might be changed, when the sands might soften and green things might grow, and open water might one day return to the face of Dune. They spoke of this dream only among themselves, and they worked toward it with the same slow patience that had carried their ancestors across so many worlds. To the great powers of the Imperium, the Fremen were little more than a rumor, a scattering of ragged desert dwellers thought to be few in number and of no great importance. The rulers who came to Arrakis to harvest the spice counted the Fremen as a nuisance at most, a wild people to be pushed aside or ignored, and they never troubled to learn how many truly lived out upon the deep sand. In this, they were greatly mistaken. For the Fremen were far more numerous than any outsider imagined, whole nations of them hidden across the wide desert, and they were bound together by faith and by hardship into a strength that lay quiet and unseen, like water held deep beneath the stone. And they were, above all, a people shaped by the desert into something both gentle and formidable. The harshness of their world had burned away all softness and waste, and left behind a people of great endurance, great loyalty, and great courage, who valued honor and kinship above almost all things. They shared their scarce water with one another as an act of deep trust, and they honored their dead with a tenderness that the outside worlds, for all their riches, had long forgotten. In their hidden sieges, they sang the old songs of their wandering ancestors, and told the old stories of the worlds they had left behind, and kept alive the memory of who they were. They had carried with them, too, across all their long roads, a quiet expectation woven into their faith, a belief that one day a figure would come among them, a voice from the outer worlds who would lead them at last toward their dream and toward their freedom. This hope had been planted in them long ago, deeper than they themselves fully understood, and it slept within their beliefs like a seed sleeping in dry ground, waiting for the water that would one day wake it. For the present, though, they asked for nothing but to be left alone upon their sands, to gather their water and guard their hidden places and go on living in the harsh world that had, against all expectation, become their home. So the Fremen dwelt upon Arrakis through age after age, unseen and underestimated, a patient people of the deep desert, holding fast to their faith, their water, and their long dream of a greener world to come. Above them, the great powers came and went, quarreling over the spice and knowing nothing of the strength that waited beneath their feet. And out upon the moonlit dunes, when the fierce heat of the day had softened into the cool of the desert night, the Fremen moved quietly across the sand with their broken, gentle steps, keeping their secrets, tending their hopes, and asking only to endure. Let that hidden and patient people, and their long faith, and their guarded and precious water, settle softly now over your own resting mind, and carry you gently down towards sleep. While the Fremen kept their patient dream out upon the sands of Arrakis, another patience, older and stranger still, was at work across the whole of the Imperium, hidden within the marriages and the bloodlines of the great houses. This was the quiet and secret labor of the Bene Gesserit, the ancient sisterhood of women whose thinking was measured not in years, but in ages, and who had set themselves, across countless generations, to guide the very shape of what humankind would one day become. To follow their design, the mind must move slowly and gently, for it was a plan so vast and so long that no single life could ever hold the whole of it, and each sister who served it saw only a small part before passing it on to those who came after. The Bene Gesserit had risen, as we have seen, in the long reshaping that followed the fall of the thinking machines, and they had trained themselves to a rare and deep mastery of body and mind. They could steady their own flesh down to the smallest workings within it, calm the beating of the heart, master pain and fear, and read in the face and voice of another the truth that words tried to hide. Above all, the highest among them, those they called Reverend Mothers, could reach back into a great inner store of memory, into the remembered lives of the mothers who had come before them, so that within a single sister there lived the gathered wisdom of a long line of women stretching back into the deep past. Yet even with all this remembered wisdom, there remained one place the sisters could not look, a certain inner darkness they could not pass through, and it was toward the crossing of that darkness that their long secret design was aimed. For the sisterhood had come to believe, through their study and their remembered lives, that it might one day be possible to bring forth a single being unlike any that had come before. A person in whom the powers of the sisters would be joined with a gift they themselves did not possess. They called this awaited one the Kwisatz Haderach, a name from an old tongue that spoke of a shortening of the way, of one who could stand in many places at once within the mind, where the Reverend Mothers could look back only into the memories of their mothers. This awaited one, they believed, would be able to look also into the memories of the Fathers, and further still, out along the branching paths of what was yet to come. In him the inner darkness would open, and the past and the future alike would lie before him like a single wide country seen from a high place. To bring forth such a being was no small hope, and the sisters knew that it could not be done in a single generation, nor in 10, nor in 100. It could be done, if it could be done at all, only by the slow and careful joining of bloodlines across a great span of time, by guiding which noble sons and which noble daughters should marry, so that certain rare qualities scattered thinly through the great houses might be gathered together little by little until at last they met within one child. And so the Bene Gesserit set in motion a breeding program of extraordinary patience, a design carried on quietly through age after age, hidden within the ordinary comings and goings of noble marriage. The manner of it was subtle, beyond the sight of those it touched. The sisters placed themselves, generation upon generation, within the courts of the great houses, serving as trusted advisors, as teachers, as companions, and above all, as the mothers of noble children. A daughter of the sisterhood might be sent to wed a certain lord, or to bear a certain nobleman a daughter, and that daughter in turn might be guided, many years later, toward a certain marriage of her own, and none of those who lived within these arrangements ever guessed that their loves and their unions were threads in a pattern far larger than themselves. The sisters kept careful record of every line, tracing which qualities appeared in which children, drawing the bloodlines slowly closer together across the centuries, always with the awaited one held quietly in mind as the far goal of it all. They worked in this way because they believed, in their deep and patient thinking, that the future of humankind must not be left wholly to chance. They had seen, in the long memories they carried, how easily whole peoples could stumble into ruin, how the powers of the Imperium balanced always upon a knife of custom and fear, and they hoped that the awaited one, when at last he came, might be a steadying hand, a mind that could see far enough ahead to guide humankind past the dangers it could not yet perceive. Whether their hope was wisdom or pride, or some mingling of the two, none could yet say, for the plan was not finished, and the being they sought had not yet been born. The sisters carried with them, too, another kind of patient work, quieter still than the shaping of bloodlines. Wherever they went among the many worlds, they sowed into the beliefs of ordinary people certain gentle seeds of expectation, old prophecies and soft legends of a coming one who would deliver and guide, so that if ever a sister found herself in danger upon some distant world, the local faith might already be prepared to shelter her and to see in her something holy. These planted beliefs slept for ages in the hearts of simple folk, doing no harm and drawing no notice, waiting like the seeds of the breeding itself for a season far away. In this the sisterhood showed once more its long habit of thinking, for it prepared not only the bloodlines, but the very ground of belief into which the awaited one might one day step, so that when he came, the hearts of many would already be turned toward him. There was, woven through all of this, a further quiet expectation that the sisters carried with a certain solemn care. They believed that when the awaited one came, he would come from a bloodline they had shaped, and that they themselves would guide him and hold him within their design, so that his great powers would serve the long purposes of the sisterhood. They planned the last steps of their breeding with particular attention, arranging in their minds which daughter should bear which child, and to which father, so that in the appointed generation a certain daughter of the sisterhood would bear a daughter, and that daughter in turn would one day wed into a certain house and complete the pattern that had been so long in the weaving. Yet even the most patient of plans move through living hearts, and living hearts do not always follow the paths laid out for them. The sisters knew this danger well, for they had watched across the ages how love and grief and loyalty could turn a carefully guided life aside from the course intended for it. They guarded against such turnings as best they could, teaching their daughters obedience to the long design and reminding them always that the purpose of the sisterhood stood above any single life or any single love. And for the most part their design held, generation folding into generation, the bloodlines drawing ever closer, the far goal drawing slowly nearer, until at last only a very few steps remained between the sisters and the being they had sought for so long. So it was that beneath the visible order of the Imperium, beneath the throne and the Landsrod, and the great trade of the houses, there ran this deep and hidden current of purpose, older and slower than any of them, shaping the bloodlines of the mighty toward an end that almost none could see. The Bene Gesserit tended their long plan as a gardener tends a tree that will not flower until long after the gardener is gone, planting and pruning and waiting, content to serve a harvest they might never live to gather. And their patience, across all those ages, was drawing at last toward its close, for the appointed generation was near, and the bloodlines they had gathered were nearly ready to meet. Let that quiet and unhurried patience, that gentle weaving across the ages, wrap softly around your own thoughts now and draw you down, slowly and easily, into deep and peaceful sleep. Among the many great houses that ruled the worlds of the Imperium, most rose and fell and quarreled in the ordinary way of noble houses, their rivalries flaring and cooling as the fortunes of trade and the favor of the emperor shifted around them. But between two of those houses there ran a hatred deeper and older than any passing quarrel, a wound that had never closed across the long generations, and it is toward that ancient enmity that the mind must now gently turn. For the story that was coming, the story of Arrakis and the desert, and the boy who would change everything, grew in large part out of the long and bitter feud between the noble House Atreides and the cruel House Harkonnen. The two houses could hardly have been more unlike one another, and perhaps it was in part their very unlikeness that had set them so long at odds. House Atreides was a house loved and admired across many worlds, known for its honor, its loyalty, and its care for the people who lived under its rule. Its lords governed with justice and with a certain warmth, and they held to their given word as to a sacred thing, so that those who served the Atreides did so gladly and gave their loyalty freely rather than out of fear. The banner of the house bore the sign of a hawk, and the name of the Atreides was spoken with respect in the councils of the Landsrod, for they were counted among the finest and most upright of all the great houses. House Harkonnen, by contrast, was feared far more than it was loved. Its rule was built upon greed and cruelty, upon the squeezing of wealth from every source without mercy, and upon a cold delight in power for its own sake. Where the Atreides won loyalty through honor, the Harkonnens compelled obedience through terror and through cunning, and they did not scruple to use poison, treachery, and betrayal to gain their ends. The lord of that house in those days was the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, a man of vast appetite and vaster ambition, patient in his scheming and utterly without pity, who had raised the fortunes of his house to great heights through methods that the more honorable houses would never have stooped to use. Between such a house and the honorable Atreides there could be little but enmity, and enmity there had long been. The roots of the feud reached back through many generations, into old betrayals and old battles whose particulars had passed half into legend. There had been, in the distant past, a great conflict in which an Atreides ancestor had brought lasting disgrace upon a Harkonnen forebear, an act of cowardice by the Harkonnen in the face of danger that the Atreides had exposed for all to see. From that ancient shame, the Harkonnens had nursed a hatred that never cooled, passing it down from father to son like a dark inheritance, so that each new generation of the house took up the old grudge as its own. The Atreides, for their part, had learned across the years to watch the Harkonnens with wary and unsleeping caution, for they knew well that the enmity between the houses was a living thing, and that the Harkonnens would seize any chance to strike at them that fortune might offer. And so the two houses moved through the long ages as rivals, whose quarrel could not be settled and would not be forgotten, each a shadow across the other's path. When one prospered, the other watched with envy and calculation. When one stumbled, the other looked for advantage. The very name of the one house was a bitterness in the mouth of the other. And children of both were raised from their earliest years to understand that between Atreides and Harkonnen there could be no true peace, only a long and watchful truce that might be broken at any hour. In the councils of the great houses, the two were seldom seated near one another, and when their representatives met by chance in the halls of the Landsraad, a cold and careful courtesy passed between them that fooled no one, for beneath it lay the old and unhealed wound. Yet for a long time the ancient customs of the Imperium held the feud within bounds, for there were strict laws that governed how the great houses might make war upon one another, laws meant to prevent the whole order of the worlds from collapsing into endless bloodshed. Open war between houses could be waged only under certain forms and with certain limits, and the use of the most terrible weapons was forbidden to all by a dread and universal law. Within these bounds, the hatred of Harkonnen for Atreides simmered on, unable to break fully into open flame, but never for a moment truly at rest. As the years passed, the balance between the two houses shifted in a way that only deepened the old enmity, for the star of House Atreides was slowly rising. The Duke who led the house in those days, a wise and careful lord, had gathered around him men of great skill and great devotion, and had built a fighting force small in number, but of remarkable quality and loyalty. His name was honored across the Landsraad, and other houses looked to him with respect and even with a growing readiness to follow his lead. The Atreides were becoming, without ever seeking it through cruelty or trickery, one of the most admired and influential houses in all the Imperium, and their good name spread from world to world. This rising fame, honorable though it was, drew upon the Atreides a danger they had not sought. For high above the quarrels of the houses sat the Padishah Emperor upon his golden throne, and the Emperor watched the great houses always with a careful and jealous eye. A house too well loved, a duke too widely admired, could come in time to seem a rival to the throne itself, and the Emperor of those days had begun to look upon the growing renown of the Atreides with quiet unease. Here, then, were the makings of a trap already forming in the shadows, for the Harkonnen hunger for revenge and the Emperor's wariness of a rising house were two currents that might one day be drawn together and joined into a single deadly design. The Harkonnens, for their part, had long dreamed of nothing so much as the utter ruin of their ancient enemies. It was not enough for the Baron that his house should prosper. He wished the Atreides thrown down entirely, their name erased, their house broken beyond all mending, and he had waited across the years with the patience of a predator for the moment when such a blow might be struck. He understood, as a cunning man understands, that the surest ruin of an enemy comes not from open challenge, but from a snare so well hidden that the victim walks into it believing he has been given a gift. And he understood, too, that the wariness of the Emperor toward the Atreides might one day be the very thing that opened the door to such a snare. So the old feud, which had smoldered so long within the bounds of custom and law, drew toward a moment of terrible opportunity. The Atreides stood at the height of their honor and their fame, loved by many and watched with unease by the one power above them all. The Harkonnens waited in the shadows, with their old hatred sharpened to a fine and patient edge. And between these forces there lay a single desert world, the priceless source of the spice, which would soon become the ground upon which the ancient quarrel would at last be brought to its bitter end. But that is the turning of the tale that waits just beyond this quiet hour, and there is no need to hurry toward it now. For the present, let the old enmity rest, held gently in the mind like a distant and half-remembered story, and let its weight fall away from you as you sink, slowly and softly, down into deep and untroubled sleep. And so, the moment came at last when the Emperor's quiet unease and the Harkonnen hunger for revenge were drawn together into a single design, cloaked so gracefully that it wore the appearance of the highest of honors. To understand what happened, the mind must move slowly and hold two things gently side by side, for the gift that was offered to House Atreides and the trap that lay hidden within it were, in truth, one and the same thing. And the beauty of the snare lay precisely in that no one could easily tell the one from the other. For long ages the desert world of Arrakis had been held and governed by House Harkonnen, and from its sands the Harkonnens had drawn wealth almost beyond counting. They had ruled Arrakis as a fief granted by the Emperor, harvesting the precious spice year upon year, and through that harvest they had raised their house to great power and great riches. Their rule over the desert world was harsh in the extreme, for they cared nothing for the planet or its people, and thought only of how much spice might be wrung from the sand and how swiftly. Across the long years of their governorship they had piled up enormous fortunes, and Arrakis had become the very cornerstone of the Harkonnen power, the source from which almost all their strength flowed. Then, without warning, the Emperor spoke, and what he decreed astonished the whole of the Landsraad. He announced that the governorship of Arrakis was to be taken from House Harkonnen and granted instead to House Atreides. To the watching houses, it seemed a mark of the Emperor's highest favor, a reward for the honor and the rising renown of the Atreides. For whoever held Arrakis held the source of the spice, and to be given rule over that one desert world was to be given a hand upon the wealth of the entire Imperium. On its surface, the grant was a magnificent gift, an elevation of the Atreides to a place of enormous power and prestige, and many of the great houses looked upon it with envy and with wonder. Yet the Duke who led House Atreides was no fool, and he understood from the first that the gift was not so simple as it appeared. He knew the long feud between his house and the Harkonnens, and he knew that no Harkonnen would surrender the richest prize in all the worlds without seeking a terrible revenge. He understood that to take up the rule of Arrakis was to walk into the very center of his enemy's old power, into a world the Harkonnens knew intimately and the Atreides did not, a world whose harsh and unfamiliar dangers might be turned against any newcomer who did not yet understand them. And he suspected, though he could not yet prove it, that the Emperor himself might have a hand in whatever was being prepared, for the sudden favor sat uneasily beside the Emperor's known wariness of a rising house. The trap, in truth, was even deeper than the Duke feared, for the Emperor and the Baron had come together in secret and had woven between them a design meant to accomplish what neither could easily do alone. The Emperor wished the two well-loved Atreides brought low, but he could not openly move against so honorable a house without turning the whole Landsraad against himself. For the other houses would never forgive an emperor who destroyed a beloved house without cause. The Baron wished his ancient enemies destroyed, but he lacked the strength to be certain of overwhelming so fine a fighting force as the Atreides had gathered, and so each supplied what the other lacked. The Emperor would lend, in the deepest secrecy, a portion of his own dreaded soldier fanatics, the most terrible warriors in all the Imperium, trained upon a cruel prison world into fighters that few forces could withstand. The Baron would use those borrowed soldiers, disguised in the colors of his own house, to fall upon the Atreides once they had been drawn out to the exposed and unfamiliar world of Arrakis. The plan was cruel in its cleverness. The Atreides were to be lured away from the strength of their home, from the world they knew and the defenses they had built across generations, and set down upon a desert planet where every advantage lay with their enemies. There they would be given a little time to settle, to believe perhaps that the gift was truly a gift, and then, at the chosen moment, the blow would fall, sudden and overwhelming, so that the house might be broken in a single stroke before it could gather itself to resist. And because the borrowed soldiers would wear Harkonnen colors, the world would believe the fall of the Atreides to be nothing more than another chapter in the old feud between the two houses, and the Emperor's hand would remain forever hidden. The Duke saw enough of the shape of the danger to know that he was being led into a snare, and yet he found that he had no way to refuse. To decline the Emperor's gift would be to defy the throne openly, an act that no single house could survive, and it would mark the Atreides at once as rebels and cast away the honor that was their greatest strength. The command of the Emperor could not be refused, and so the Duke was left with only one course, which was to accept the gift, to go to Arrakis with his eyes open, and to try, through wisdom and courage, to turn the trap aside, or to survive it. He resolved that if he must walk into the snare, he would at least do so knowingly, and would seek upon that desert world some strength his enemies had not counted upon. For the Duke had come to understand a thing that both the Emperor and the Baron had overlooked. He knew that upon Arrakis there dwelt the Fremen, the hardy people of the deep desert, and though the outside worlds counted them as few and of no importance, the Duke suspected that they might be far more numerous and far more formidable than anyone believed. He hoped, if he could win their trust and their friendship, to find among them an ally strong enough to change the whole balance of the coming struggle, a strength drawn from the desert itself that no scheme woven in the halls of power had thought to weigh. In that hope, faint and uncertain as it was, lay the one thread by which the fortunes of his house might yet be saved. So House Atreides prepared to leave the world it had ruled for so long and to make the great journey to Arrakis, carrying with it its honor, its loyal people, and its wary hope, moving all the while toward a snare that its lord already half perceived. Above them the Emperor watched from his golden throne, and in the shadows the Baron waited with his patient malice, and the pieces of the long design slid quietly into their places. Yet the tale need not be hurried, for its turning waits beyond this hour. Let the great journey and the hidden snare and the desert world drift now to the edge of your thoughts, and let their weight fall gently away from you as you settle down, slowly and softly, into deep and peaceful sleep. At the heart of the house that now prepared to journey toward the desert and its hidden snare stood three people, joined by love and by duty, in whom the great currents of that age quietly met. There was the Duke, the just and careful lord of the Atreides. There was the lady who stood beside him, a woman of the Bene Gesserit who had given him her heart against the wishes of her order. And there was their son, a thoughtful and gifted boy in whom the long designs of the sisterhood and the honor of his father came together without his ever fully knowing it. Before the tale carries us out to Arrakis, let the mind rest gently upon these three, for it was around them that all the rest was to turn. The Duke was named Leto, and he was, by the measure of his own people and of many beyond them, the finest of lords. He governed his house and his worlds with a steady justice, holding always to his given word, caring for the people who served him as a good shepherd cares for his flock. He was neither soft nor weak, for he had learned the arts of war and of rule, and could be firm when firmness was needed. Yet his firmness was tempered always by fairness and by a deep sense of honor. Those who served him did so not from fear, but from love, giving their loyalty freely because they trusted him. And this loyalty, freely given, was in truth the greatest strength of his house, worth more than gold or soldiers or the favor of the throne. He carried, too, a quiet sorrow in these days, for he perceived the shape of the danger that lay before his house, and he knew that he was leading those he loved toward a snare he might not be able to turn aside. Beside the Duke stood the Lady Jessica, and she was a woman of rare depth and grace. She had been born and raised within the Bene Gesserit, and trained in all the deep arts of that ancient sisterhood, so that she could read the hidden meanings in a face or a voice, could master her own body and calm her own fears, and could reach, in some measure, into the gathered memory of the women who had come before her. She had been sent to the Duke by her order to serve a purpose within their long design, for the sisterhood had wished her to bear the Duke a daughter who would have had her own appointed place in the slow weaving of the bloodlines toward the awaited one. Yet Jessica had done a thing the sisterhood had not asked of her and had not wished. She had come to love the Duke deeply and truly, and out of that love, and out of her wish to give him the heir his heart desired, she had chosen to bear him a son instead of a daughter. In making that choice, Jessica had stepped aside from the path her order had laid out, and though she could not yet know what her choice would bring, she had, in her love, quietly turned the great design of the sisterhood from its intended course. She bore this knowledge with a certain grave tenderness, for she honored her order and its long purposes even as she followed her own heart, and she gave to her son a love as fierce and as watchful as any mother has ever given a child. She had begun, moreover, to teach him in secret some of the deep arts of the Bene Gesserit, the disciplines of mind and body that were meant only for the daughters of the sisterhood. And in this, too, she went beyond what her order would have permitted, giving to a boy the training reserved for women, without yet understanding where such teaching might one day lead. Their son was named Paul, and he was, even as a boy, a person of unusual gifts. He was thoughtful and quiet, quick of mind and deep of feeling, trained from his earliest years in many arts by the loyal men of his father's house. He had been taught the ways of war and of the blade by the finest of warriors, and the arts of the mind and of statecraft by wise teachers, and the deep disciplines of the Bene Gesserit by his mother, so that in him there was gathered a rare breadth of learning and of skill. Yet there was in him something more, something that none of his teachers had planted, and that even his mother did not fully understand. A depth. Beneath the depth, a stillness at the center of him that seemed to reach toward things not yet come. He was, though no one yet spoke it plainly, the meeting point of the sisterhood's long breeding and his father's noble line. A boy in whom rare qualities long scattered through the great houses had at last been drawn together. Even in his boyhood, before ever he set foot upon the sands of Arrakis, Paul had begun to know strange stirrings within his mind. There came to him, now and then, brief visions of things that had not yet happened, fleeting glimpses of places he had never seen and faces he did not yet know. Dreams that lingered when he woke and troubled him with their vividness. He did not understand these dreams, and he spoke of them to few, but they suggested that within him something was slowly waking, some gift of sight that reached across the ordinary bounds of time. His mother watched these signs with a mixture of hope and quiet fear, for she knew enough of the sisterhood's long design to wonder, in the deepest part of her heart, whether her son might be more than merely a gifted boy, whether the choice she had made in love might have brought forth something the sisterhood had sought across all its long ages. So these three stood together at the center of their house, bound by a love that was true and deep, and by a shared destiny that none of them could yet fully see. The Duke, wise and honorable, leading his people forward with open eyes toward a danger he could not refuse. The lady, graceful and strong, carrying the secret weight of her order and the fiercer weight of her love, having turned a great design aside for the sake of the son she cherished. And the boy, gifted beyond his years, in whom past and future seemed quietly to meet, standing all unknowing upon the threshold of a story far greater than a lost duke's inheritance. Around these three the great forces of the age had gathered, the schemes of emperors and barons, the long patience of the sisterhood, the hidden strength of the desert, and all of it drew now toward the world of sand, where their fate awaited them. There is no need, in this quiet hour, to follow them yet into what was to come. Let them stand together a little longer in the calm before the journey. The good Duke, the loving lady, and the gifted boy, held gently in the mind like a family portrait softened by warm light. Let the love that bound them, and the quiet strength that lay within each of them, settle softly over your own resting thoughts. And as their story waits, patient and unhurried, for the hours still to come, let its gentle weight carry you now, slowly and easily, down into deep and peaceful sleep. At the heart of the noble House Atreides, in the years before the great turning of its fortune, there stood a small family whose quiet love would come to shape the whole long river of the time that followed. Rest now, and let their story move over you slowly, the way warm evening light moves across the walls of an old and gentle home. For before the desert, before the fall, before the rising of the prophet who would change the stars, there were only three people who loved one another: a duke, a lady, and a boy, living out their ordinary days upon a green and water-rich world far from the sands of Arrakis. The duke was named Leto, and he was a just and careful lord, beloved by his people across the ocean world of Caladan, where the rain fell soft and the sea lay wide and gray beneath a mild and drifting sky. He had come to his rule while still young, and he carried the weight of it with a steadiness that others trusted at once. He was neither cruel nor greedy, and he did not rule through fear as some of the great houses did. Instead, he ruled through loyalty freely given, gathering to his side men and women who served him not because they were forced to, but because they believed in him. This was the true strength of House Atreides, a strength woven not of coin nor of terror, but of faith between a lord and those who followed him, and it was a strength that his enemies never fully understood. Beside the Duke stood the Lady Jessica, and she was a woman of the ancient sisterhood called the Bene Gesserit, trained from her earliest years in the deep disciplines of body and mind that the sisters had gathered across the long ages. She could read the smallest signs in a face or a voice, and she could master her own flesh down to the quiet workings of the cell. And she carried within her the patient thinking of an order that measured time in generations rather than in years. Yet for all her training, Jessica had done a thing the sisterhood had not asked of her, a thing born not of duty, but of love. She had come to Duke Leto as a bound concubine, given to his house by the plans of her order, and she had been instructed to bear him only daughters. For the sisters wove their long designs through the careful joining of noble lines. But Jessica loved the Duke, and in her love she chose to give him a son instead, defying the wishes of the very order that had raised her. That son was Paul, and he was a thoughtful and gifted boy in whom the two great streams of his parents quietly met. From his father, he took the sense of duty and the loyalty and the care for others that made the Atreides beloved. And from his mother, he took the hidden training of the sisterhood, the stillness of mind, the watchfulness, the strange and quiet gifts that few outside the order ever learned. He was taught in many arts by the loyal men who served his father, for the house kept about it a small company of remarkable souls, each of whom poured something of himself into the raising of the young heir. From one he learned the ways of blade and shield, from another the discipline of the fighting arts, from another the songs and the wit that lightened the long evenings, and from his mother he learned the deeper stillness that lay beneath all the rest. Paul grew as a boy who thought more than he spoke, and who watched the world with a patient and searching attention that seemed older than his years. There were nights when strange dreams came to him, dreams of places he had never seen and of a desert he did not know. Dreams so vivid that when he woke, he could not always tell whether they had been memory or foretelling. He did not understand them, and neither, at first, did those around him, though his mother watched him with a growing quiet wonder, for she began to see in her son the faint early signs of something the sisterhood had sought across uncounted generations. She said little of this, even to herself, for the hope was too large and too dangerous to hold openly, and so she kept it folded away in the deep places of her mind, watching and waiting as the sisters had always watched and waited. For within the long secret design of the Bene Gesserit there lay a single distant aim, the bringing forth at last of one who could look where the sisters could not, across both the past and the many branching paths of the future. And though no one spoke of it in the halls of Caladan, the truth was that in giving Leto a son, Jessica had moved a piece in that ancient game far sooner than her order had intended. Paul stood, though he did not yet know it, near the meeting place of two great forces, the honor and loyalty of his father's house on the one hand, and the long patient breeding of the sisterhood on the other. And in him these two things had quietly come together into a single life. The days upon Caladan passed gently for the family, filled with the ordinary rhythms of a ruling house. The Duke tended to the affairs of his world, hearing the concerns of his people, walking among the fishing folk and the farmers, keeping the old balances that a wise lord must keep. The lady moved through the halls with her quiet grace, teaching her son, watching the court, reading the currents beneath the surface of things as her training had taught her to do. And the boy studied and grew, and roamed the shores of his ocean home, and dreamed his strange dreams, and slowly became the young man who would one day carry the fate of many worlds. There was, in those years, a great and simple happiness in the house, though none of them spoke of it as happiness, for happiness that is truly lived is rarely named while it lasts. Yet even in that gentle time, the shadow of larger things had begun to gather far beyond the gray seas of Caladan. For House Atreides had grown beloved and admired across the wide Landsraad, the great council of the noble houses, and its rising fame had begun to draw uneasy eyes toward it. A house loved by many is a house watched by the powerful, and the loyalty that was the Atreides' strength was also the thing that made others afraid. But of all this the family knew only the faintest whispers, and Paul, in those early days, knew almost nothing at all. He knew only his father's steady hand, and his mother's quiet voice, and the sound of the sea, and the men who taught him, and the dreams that came to him in the night. There were, too, the loyal companions of the house who moved through those years like fixed and comforting stars, the men who had bound their lives to the service of the Atreides and who treated the young heir almost as their own. One among them was a warrior of great skill and great heart, who taught the boy the handling of weapons and who carried within his broad and cheerful manner a devotion so deep that it never needed to be spoken. Another was a master of the fighting arts who tested the boy again and again, sharpening him with a strictness that was itself a form of love. And there was the old and faithful mentor, keeper of the house's counsel, whose careful mind weighed every danger and every chance, guiding the Duke through the tangled affairs of the Landsraad and the throne. Around these steady souls the boy grew, and from each of them he took something that would remain with him always, so that when the time of trial came, he would carry within himself the gathered strength of every hand that had helped to raise him. So it was that at the center of a great and ancient story there stood, for a time, only these three, bound together by love and by duty, and by the unseen threads of the sisterhood's long design. The Duke, who ruled through loyalty, the lady who chose love over the commands of her order, and the boy in whom the past and the future quietly met, all of them living out their days upon a peaceful world, unaware of how soon and how swiftly that peace would be asked to end. Let them rest there now, in the mild light of Caladan, in the years before the desert called them. Let the sound of that far gray sea move slowly through your thoughts, rising and falling, carrying you gently downward into stillness, into ease, into the deep and quiet calm that waits for you now. In time the call came that would carry the family from the soft rains of Caladan to the burning sands of Arrakis, and though it wore the shape of a great honor, beneath that shape lay a trap that had been long and carefully prepared. Rest now, and let the story move over you gently, for though it tells of a fall, it will tell of it softly, the way one speaks of things that happened long ago and far away, things that no longer need to be feared, only remembered and then released. The Emperor upon the golden throne, watching the rising fame of House Atreides with a quiet unease, had devised a design that seemed on its surface a gift of great generosity. He granted to Duke Leto the rule of Arrakis, the desert world that held the single most precious thing in all the universe, the spice melange, which lengthened life and sharpened the mind and made possible the travel of the great ships between the stars. To be given Arrakis was to be given a hand at the very throat of the Imperium, for whoever held the spice held a measure of power over every world that depended upon it. And so the granting looked like favor, like reward, like the Emperor raising a beloved house still higher. But beneath that shining surface the trap lay coiled and waiting. For Arrakis had long been held by the cruel House Harkonnen, the old and bitter enemy of the Atreides, whose feud reached back through generations of betrayal and battle. The Harkonnens had grown vastly rich upon the spice, and they would not surrender their treasure quietly, whatever the Emperor might command. And the Emperor knew this well, for it was the very heart of his plan. He wished the two houses to fall upon one another, and he had secretly promised his own dreaded soldier fanatics to the Harkonnen cause, lending the strength of the throne to the coming blow while keeping his own hand hidden from the sight of the Landsraad. In this way, the Emperor meant to see the Atreides destroyed without ever appearing to have raised a weapon against them. Duke Leto understood, or at least suspected, much of this. He was not a man easily deceived, and he saw the shape of the snare even as he accepted it, for to refuse the Emperor's command was itself a kind of ruin, and so he chose to walk into the desert with his eyes open, hoping that his own strength and his own care might turn the trap aside. He carried with him the loyal men of his house, and his lady, and his son, and the whole ordered life of a great family transplanted from an ocean world to a world of endless sand. And so the Atreides made the long journey across the void, and came at last to Arrakis, and took up the rule of the desert planet and the harvest of its priceless spice. Upon that dry world, the Duke set himself at once to the difficult work of building a strength that might hold. He knew that his true hope lay not in the walls of the city, nor in the machines of the spice harvest, but in the people of the deep desert, the Fremen, who dwelt unseen among the dunes and who were far more numerous and far fiercer than the outsiders had ever guessed. He sought to win their trust, to make of them allies rather than enemies, for he saw in them a hidden power that might tip the whole balance in his favor. And in this he began to succeed, for the Fremen watched the new Duke with cautious eyes, and found in him something they had not expected, a lord who did not despise them, a lord who valued their lives and their knowledge and their friendship, a lord who understood that on Arrakis water was more precious than any coin. Yet the trap was already closing, and it closed with a terrible and sudden swiftness. For within the house itself there lay a betrayal that no loyalty could have foreseen, a treachery hidden in a place the Duke had trusted without question. Through this hidden hand, the defenses of the Atreides were quietly undone from within, the shields that should have protected them made useless at the very moment of need. And on a single dark night, the blow fell. The Harkonnen forces, joined by the Emperor's own hidden soldiers, struck against the house with an overwhelming strength, pouring down upon the city and the stronghold in numbers that could not be turned aside. In that one night, the ordered strength of House Atreides was thrown down. The loyal men who had served the Duke fought and fell, or were scattered into the desert, or were taken. The great house that had ruled through loyalty and honor was broken in a matter of hours, its halls overrun, its people slain or driven out. And the Duke himself, Leto, the just and careful lord who had walked into the trap with open eyes, was taken by his enemies and lost, brought down not by any failing of his own courage, but by the treachery within and the vast weight of forces arrayed in secret against him. So passed a good man, and so seemed to end the house he had built, in the space of a single terrible night upon the sands of a world that was not his own. To those who watched from the outside, and to the enemies who had planned it all, it seemed that the story was finished. The Atreides were fallen, the Duke was gone, the house was broken, and the Harkonnens had reclaimed their desert treasure with the quiet blessing of the throne. The Emperor's design appeared complete, the rising house cast down without any visible hand from the golden seat. The old feud settled at last in blood and sand. And for a time the sands lay quiet, and the enemies of the Atreides believed that they had won, and that nothing remained of the family that had come across the void with such hope. But not all had been lost in that dark hour, though the enemies did not yet know it. For amid the ruin and the slaughter, two figures had slipped away from the closing net, carried by loyalty and by chance and by something deeper still into the vast dark reaches of the desert. The lady and the boy, Jessica and Paul, had escaped the fall of the house, fleeing into the sands where all who hunted them believed they would surely perish. And so the story that seemed to end in that single night did not truly end, for its most important thread had escaped into the deep places of Arrakis, waiting, unseen, for the long tale to begin again. It is worth remembering, as the story turns toward its darkest hour, that the Duke had known the danger and had chosen to face it rather than to flee from it, for he had understood that honor sometimes asks a man to walk knowingly into the shadow. He had gathered his people, had spoken with his son of the burdens that a great house must carry, had looked upon the desert world with clear and unfrightened eyes, and had set himself to build what strength he could in the little time that was given him. That his effort was undone by treachery rather than by any weakness of his own is the deepest sorrow of the tale, and yet it is also the seed of what would follow. For the loyalty he had planted did not die with him. It lived on in the hearts of those who escaped, in the memory of a Lord who had ruled through faith rather than fear, and in the Son who carried his Father's name into the sand. What seemed in that hour to be an ending was, though none could yet see it, the quiet turning of the story toward a far greater beginning. Let the memory of that night rest gently now, softened by all the time that lies between. The fall of a great house is a heavy thing to hold, and so let it settle and grow still, the way dust settles upon the desert after a storm has passed, the way the sand goes quiet under the wide and patient stars. What was lost, and yet the story did not close, and there is comfort in the knowing of that. Breathe slowly, and let the weight of it drift away from you, and let yourself sink softly downward into calm, into rest, into the deep and easy quiet that waits for you now. So it was that the lady and the boy passed out of the ruin of their house and into the deep desert, where all who hunted them believed that no one could live. Rest now, and let this part of the story move over you as gently as the night wind moves over the dunes. For it is the tale of how a lost and grieving son vanished from the sight of his enemies and slowly, quietly, began to become something far greater than the child of a fallen duke. When the house fell, Paul and his mother Jessica were carried away from the slaughter by the loyalty of those who served them, given the barest chance of life, and sent out into the open sands with little more than the clothing they wore and the training they carried within them. Behind them lay the broken city and the enemies who believed them already dead. Before them lay the vast and empty desert of Arrakis, a place of endless dunes and merciless sun, where water was more precious than any treasure, and where the great worms moved beneath the sand like slow and patient gods. To flee into such a place was, to the eyes of their pursuers, the same as choosing to die, and so the hunt for them soon grew slack. For who would waste effort chasing two souls already given to the desert? Yet the desert did not kill them, for they carried gifts that their enemies had not weighed. The Lady Jessica bore within her all the deep training of the Bene Gesserit, the mastery of her own body, and the reading of the world around her, and the boy Paul had been taught from his earliest years in many arts, and had begun, even before the fall, to awaken within himself the strange and searching sight that came to him in dreams. Together they endured the first hard days, learning quickly what the desert demanded, moving by night when the air was cool, and resting by day in whatever shelter they could find, hoarding their water, watching the sands, listening always for the slow, deep passage of the worms. And in the deep desert they were found, not by their enemies, but by the people of the sand, the Fremen, who moved unseen across the dunes, and who knew every hidden way of that harsh world. The Fremen were the descendants of long-wandering believers who had come to Arrakis in ages past, and they had made of the cruel planet a home that no outsider could match, learning to live where none others could, hoarding every drop of moisture, moving in secret, far more numerous and far fiercer than the powers of the Imperium had ever guessed. They came upon the lady and the boy in the open sand, and in that meeting lay the turning of the whole long story, for the Fremen did not slay the strangers, but studied them, and weighed them, and found in them something worth the keeping. For the Fremen carried among themselves an old expectation, a shape of prophecy long planted in their hearts, of a voice from the outer world who would come to lead them and to change their desert into a place of water and life. When they looked upon the boy who had come out of the ruin of a great house, and upon the mother who moved with the quiet power of a trained mind, some among them began to wonder whether the long-awaited signs had come at last. And so, rather than casting the strangers out, they took them in, drawing them into the hidden strongholds carved deep within the rock, into the close and careful life of the desert people. There, among the Fremen, Paul began to disappear from the world he had known and to be remade by the world he had entered. He took a desert name, setting aside for a time the name of the fallen house, becoming to those around him not the son of a lost duke, but a young man of the sand, tested and measured by the harsh customs of his new people. He learned the ways of the deep desert, the discipline of water, the reading of the wind, the art of moving across the open dunes without drawing the great worms. He learned to wear the close-fitting suit that captured and returned the body's own moisture, so that a man might cross the killing sands and live. He learned the fighting arts of the Fremen, which were swift and merciless, and shaped by a life in which every contest might be for survival, and in these he proved himself again and again. For the training of his house had prepared him well, and the desert only sharpened what was already keen. And as the boy learned the ways of the sand, something deeper stirred within him, growing stronger with each passing season. The strange dreams that had visited him upon the ocean world of Caladan came now more often and more clearly, and among the Fremen, surrounded by the spice that saturated all of desert life, his hidden sight began to open wider than it ever had before. He began to see, faintly at first and then with a terrible clarity, the branching paths of what might come to be, the many futures spreading outward from the choices of the present, like the countless channels of a great delta. This was the awakening of the very gift the Bene Gesserit had sought across their long generations, rising now not in a controlled and guarded court, but in the open freedom of the desert, in the heart of a grieving young man who had lost everything and found, in that loss, the beginning of a new and larger self. His mother watched this awakening with a quiet awe that she kept carefully hidden, for she understood better than any what it might mean, and she understood too how heavy such sight would be for one so young to carry. Yet she did not turn from it, and she did not turn from her people's new place among the Fremen, but bent her own great training toward securing their safety and their standing within the desert tribes, weaving herself into the deep faith of the Sand People as only one of her order could. In this way, mother and son sank ever deeper into the hidden world of the Fremen, until the two who had fled a broken house became, little by little, a part of the very people among whom they had taken refuge. And all the while, the enemies of the Atreides believed that the boy was dead, lost to the sands like so many before him, no longer a threat to their designs. They did not know that in the deep desert a lost heir was being remade into a leader, that a grieving child was learning the ways of a fierce and patient people, that the very gift the powers of the Imperium had never fully understood was awakening in a place beyond their reach. The most important thread of the whole long story had slipped their grasp entirely, and it was growing, quietly, in the hidden strongholds of the sand, waiting for the season when it would rise into the light. Let this part of the story rest gently now, in the cool dark of the desert night, where a young man once vanished from the eyes of his enemies and began, unseen, to become something more. There is a deep peace in a thing that grows in secret and in patience, unhurried, drawing its strength from the quiet. Let that same unhurried peace settle over you now, slow and soft and sure. and let yourself sink downward with it, past the surface of your thoughts, into the deep, still calm that waits below, gentle and wide and welcoming as the sleeping sands beneath the stars. Among the Fremen, the lost heir grew into a leader and a prophet, and out of the desert there rose a name that would one day be spoken across all the worlds. Rest now, and let this part of the story carry you gently onward, for it tells of a great rising, and yet it will tell of it softly, without haste and without alarm, the way one watches a slow dawn spread across a wide and quiet horizon. The young man who had come out of the ruin of his house took among the desert people a new name, and in time he became known to them as Muad'Dib, a name drawn from the small, strong creatures of the sand, a name that spoke of one who knew the ways of the desert and belonged to it. Under that name, he grew from a stranger among the Fremen into one of their own, and then into something more than one of their own, for the gift that had awakened in him deepened with each passing season until he could see, more clearly than any before him, the branching paths of what was and what might yet be. The Bene Gesserit had sought across their long generations for a being who could look where the sisters could not, across both the memory of the past and the many roads of the future, and in the deep desert that being had come at last into his full awakening. To ride with the Fremen, Muad'Dib mastered the greatest test of the sand, the mounting and the riding of the vast worms of the desert, the enormous creatures that moved beneath the dunes and shaped the whole life of Arrakis. To call one of these great beasts to the surface and to climb upon its back and to guide it across the open desert was among the Fremen the mark of a true man of the sand, and Muad'Dib learned this art and made it his own. Upon the backs of the worms, the Fremen could travel swiftly and strike where their enemies least expected. And so, the mastery of the worms became a mastery of the whole desert, and the desert, in turn, became a weapon in the hands of the people who had always been underestimated. For the Fremen were far more numerous and far fiercer than the powers of the Imperium had ever guessed, and under the leadership of Muad'Dib, they began to gather into a single force, welded together by faith and by purpose. Where before they had lived scattered across the deep desert, hidden in their strongholds, now they began to move as one people, striking at the harvest of the spice, harrying the forces of their oppressors, vanishing again into the sands before any blow could fall upon them in return. The Harkonnens, who had reclaimed the desert world and believed it firmly in their grasp, found the ground itself turning against them, found their spice harvests failing and their soldiers falling to an enemy they could neither find nor hold, an enemy that rose from the sand and returned to it like water sinking into dry ground. And as Muad'Dib led the Fremen in this rising, he became to them not only a war leader, but a figure of prophecy fulfilled, the voice from the outer world that their old faith had long foretold. His name passed from mouth to mouth across the desert, gathering to it a fervor that grew with every victory, until the fighting men of the sand followed him not merely as a commander, but as the promised one who would remake their world. This devotion was a mighty strength, for it bound the Fremen to his cause with a fire that no ordinary loyalty could match. Yet, Muad'Dib, with his opening sight, saw also the darker shape of what such devotion might become, saw the paths along which his name might sweep outward as a holy fire across the stars. And he carried that knowledge as a heavy and lonely weight, even as he was borne upward by the rising he had begun. In time, the rising against the Harkonnens grew into something far larger, a challenge to the highest power in all the Imperium, for it had been the Emperor himself who had lent his hidden soldiers to the fall of House Atreides, and Muad'Dib, with his gift of sight, understood the full shape of the design that had brought his house to ruin. And so his war was not only against the cruel house that had ruled the desert, but against the golden throne that had ordered its return. When at last the powers of the Imperium came in their full strength to Arrakis, believing they could crush the desert rebellion beneath the weight of their soldiers and their ships, they found instead that the desert and its people, gathered under Muad'Dib, could not be broken. Riding the great worms, moving with the storms, striking with the ferocity of a people who had nothing left to lose and everything at last to gain, the Fremen overturned the might that had been sent against them. So it came to pass that the lost heir of a fallen house rose to cast down the very throne that had sought his family's ruin. Muad'Dib, the boy who had vanished into the sand, stood at the last as the master of Arrakis and the holder of the spice, and with that mastery he held a hand at the throat of the whole Imperium, for without the spice no ship could cross the void, and no order could endure. Before that power the old emperor could not stand, and the golden throne passed at last from the house that had held it for so long into the hands of the desert prophet. The feud that had burned between Atreides and Harkonnen was settled. The design of the throne was undone, and the young man who had lost everything upon a single dark night rose to become emperor over the known worlds. Yet with that rising came the very thing that Muad'Dib had foreseen and dreaded, for the fervor that had gathered about his name did not rest once the throne was won. From Arrakis, a holy war swept outward across the stars, carried by the fighting men of the sand and by the countless faithful who took up his name, a great and terrible tide of belief that poured across world after world in the name of the desert prophet. This was the flood he had glimpsed in his opening sight even before he took the throne, and though he had risen upon it, he could not fully turn it aside, for a faith once kindled in the hearts of a whole people moves with a force greater than any single will. And so the story of the boy who vanished into the sand became the story of an empire remade, and of a war that spread his name to the farthest reaches of the settled worlds. Let all of this rise and settle gently now, softened by the long distance of time. The rising of a prophet, the turning of a throne, the sweeping of a holy tide across the stars, these are vast things, and yet from far enough away even the vastest things grow quiet and still, like distant lights seen through a calm night. Let them grow quiet now within you, and let the greatness of that far story ask nothing of you but rest. Breathe slowly, and let each breath carry you a little further down into the soft and boundless calm that waits below, where the story continues on its own and asks only that you sleep. Long after the rising of the desert prophet, when his name had already passed into legend across the settled worlds, his rule gave way at last to that of his son, who took upon himself a fate stranger and heavier than any that had come before. Rest now, and let this final part of the long story carry you the furthest of all, out past the age of the great houses and the desert war, into a distance so vast that the whole of what came before becomes a single quiet chapter in a much greater book of time. The son was named Leto, the second to carry that name, and he inherited both the throne of his father and the terrible sight that his father had borne. With that sight, he looked upon the paths of the future as his father had looked, and he saw, spreading out before all of humankind, a danger so great and so distant that no ordinary rule could turn it aside. He saw that humanity, left to the patterns it had always followed, might one day come to its ending, might be gathered and stilled, and finally extinguished by forces it could not foresee. And he saw, threading through all the countless dark paths of the future, one narrow and difficult road that led away from that ending, a single course that might carry humankind through the long ages and out the other side into safety. This road he came to call the Golden Path, and he resolved, at a cost almost beyond imagining, to set his whole being toward walking it. To follow that path, Leto II made a choice that no ruler had ever made before him. A choice that would remake his very body and cut him off from the ordinary company of his kind. He joined himself to the small early forms of the great worms of Arrakis, letting them merge with his flesh, so that over the long years he became something no longer wholly human, a being caught between man and worm, vast and strange, and enduring far beyond the span of any mortal life. In this way, he became what later ages would call the God Emperor, a living merging of the human and the creature that had shaped the whole life of the desert world, and he set his changed and mighty form upon the throne of all the worlds. His reign did not last for years, nor for centuries, but for thousands upon thousands of years, a span so long that whole civilizations rose and settled and were forgotten within it, while he endured on and on, changing slowly with the passing of the ages. Through all that immense time, he held the worlds of humankind within a single steady grip, ruling with a patience that no ordinary mind could have sustained, guiding the whole of his people along the narrow road he had chosen. His rule was a long and quiet stillness laid across the settled worlds, a peace held so firmly and for so long that it became at last a kind of confinement, a stillness that pressed upon humankind until the desire to break free and to scatter outward grew within it like a slow and gathering tide. And this was the very thing that Leto II had intended, though few in his long age could understand it. For he had seen that a humankind held too tightly and for too long would one day burst its bonds with such force that it would fling itself outward across the whole of creation, into reaches so vast and so many that no single power could ever again gather it all into one grasp, and so no single blow could ever again bring it to its ending. His endless reign was not meant to last forever, but to build within his people a pressure and a hunger that when finally released would carry them beyond all danger, beyond all counting, beyond all control. The long stillness he laid upon the worlds was the coiling of a great spring, drawn back across the ages, so that when at last it was let go, it would send humankind flying safely into the deep and unknown dark. When at last that immense reign came to its close, and the God Emperor's long watch upon the worlds finally ended, the spring he had wound across the ages was released. Freed from the grip that had held it still for so long, humankind burst outward from the settled worlds and scattered across the unknown reaches of the universe, spreading into distances beyond all mapping and beyond all counting, into a vastness so great that never again could the whole of it be gathered or ruled or brought to a single ending. This was the scattering, the great flinging outward of the human race into the endless dark, and it was the fruit of the God Emperor's long and lonely sacrifice, the arrival at last upon the far side of the golden path he had walked for so many thousands of years. And so the long river of the time reaches its widest and most distant flowing, out past the desert prophet and his holy war, out past the fall of the great house and the trap upon the sands, out past the empires and the sisterhood and the navigators and the mentats, back and back to the ancient rising against the thinking machines where the whole story began. From that first great struggle for the freedom of the human mind, through all the long ages of houses and thrones and hidden designs, the story flows onward at last into a future so vast that humankind spreads beyond all knowing, scattered like countless seeds upon the wind of the stars, free and uncounted and no longer bound. It is a story that begins in bondage and ends in a boundless freedom, and having flowed so far, it grows at last very calm and very still. Let the whole of it rest gently within you now, the machines cast down, the great schools risen in their place, the desert world and its precious sand, the boy who vanished and the prophet who rose, the changed emperor who walked the long road across the ages, and the great scattering of humankind into the far and quiet dark. There is nothing left in all of it that asks anything of you, nothing to hold and nothing to carry, only a long and finished story flowing softly to its close. Let your thoughts drift out along that river of time, slow and unhurried, growing fainter and softer with every gentle turn, until they too grow still. Breathe slowly, and let the vast calm of that distant future settle over you like the quiet of the deep desert beneath the wide and patient stars, holding you gently, easing you downward, and letting you rest at last in the deep and peaceful stillness that has been waiting for you all along. And so the long river of time comes gently to its close, and our small and steady boat drifts at last into still water. Together we have traveled across some 15,000 years, from the deep and distant past all the way to the far shining future, and now the whole of that journey lies quietly behind us. There is nothing left to reach for, and nothing left to do but to rest. You have seen the age when humankind gave itself over to thinking machines, and the great crusade that cast those machines down forever, leaving behind the one commandment that shaped every age that followed. You have watched the human mind rise again in the Mentats, and the ancient sisterhood of the Bene Gesserit weave its patient designs, and the navigators of the Spacing Guild open the roads between the stars. You have seen the vast combine that bound the worlds in trade, the golden throne of the Padisha emperors, and the strict order of the great houses. You have come to the desert world of Arrakis and the spice hidden in its sands, and to the fierce and secret people of the deep desert. You have followed the long feud of two great houses, the trap laid upon the noble Atreides, the fall of that house in a single night, and the rise of the young prophet Muad'Dib among the Fremen. And at the very end, you have looked upon the god who wore the shape of a worm and reigned for thousands of years, and upon the great scattering of humankind out beyond all the known stars. There is nothing now that you must remember. You may let all of it go, softly, the way the long ages themselves let one another go, without haste and without sorrow. Let the machines lie quiet, let the throne grow dim, let the desert winds fall still, and let the whole vast history sink back into the gentle dark from which we drew it. Your body is heavy and warm, your breathing is slow and even, and there is nothing more for you to do tonight. Let the last of the words dissolve, and let yourself sink the rest of the way down into deep and peaceful sleep. Good night. Rest well, and whenever you wish to drift once more along the long river of time and wander through the ages of the stars, this journey will be here, waiting to carry you softly back into sleep.